A city without walls because its men were its walls. Sparta. The very name echoes through time like a war cry across mountain valleys. These were people who measured wealth not in gold, but in courage, who raised children to become soldiers from the moment they could walk, and who built a society so unique that the ancient world watched in awe and terror. For over 700 years, the Spartans dominated the Greek world through sheer military excellence and an unwavering commitment to their way of life. Welcome to History in History. Today, we embark on perhaps the most fascinating journey through the ancient world. We are going to explore every corner of Spartan civilization, from its mysterious origins in the misty valleys of the Peloponnese to its eventual decline and the lasting shadow it casts across human history. This is not merely a story of battles and conquests, though there will be plenty of those. This is the story of an entire people who chose to live differently from everyone else in the ancient world, and in doing so created a legend that refuses to die. The Spartans called themselves the Lacedaemonians, taking their name from the region of Lacedaemon, also known as Laconia, where their city stood. The word Spartan itself has entered our modern vocabulary as a description of anything austere, disciplined, or stripped of luxury. When we describe a room as Spartan, we mean it has only what is necessary and nothing more. When we speak of Spartan discipline, we mean the kind of self-control that borders on the superhuman. This is perhaps the greatest testament to Spartan influence. 3,000 years after their peak, we still use their name to describe the very qualities they held most dear. But who were these people really? Beyond the legends, beyond the movies, beyond the stories that have grown larger with each telling, who were the actual Spartans? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might expect. They were Greeks, yes, but Greeks who developed along a completely different path than their neighbours in Athens, Corinth, or Thebes. While other Greek cities embraced philosophy, art, democracy, and trade, Sparta focused almost exclusively on one thing: creating the perfect warrior society. This was not a decision made overnight. It evolved over centuries through a combination of geography, necessity, and deliberate social engineering. The Spartans found themselves in a unique situation. They had conquered a large population of people called the Helots, who outnumbered them perhaps 10 to 1. To maintain control over this vast subject population, the Spartans needed to be constantly ready for war. Every aspect of their society eventually oriented itself around this central need. The result was something the ancient world had never seen before and would never see again. A city-state that functioned more like a permanent military camp than a normal community. A place where individual desires were completely subordinated to the needs of the state. A society where women had more freedom than anywhere else in Greece, but where weak infants might be left to die on mountainsides. A people who produced almost no art, literature, or philosophy, but whose military achievements became the stuff of eternal legend. To understand Sparta, we must first understand the landscape that shaped it. The Peloponnese is the large peninsula that forms the southern portion of mainland Greece. It connects to the rest of Greece by a narrow strip of land called the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnese itself is mountainous and divided into several distinct regions. Sparta sat in the southeastern part, in a long valley called the Eurotas Valley, surrounded by mountains on almost every side. The Taygetus mountain range rose dramatically to the west, its peaks often covered in snow, even when the valley below basked in Mediterranean warmth. To the east, the Parnon Mountains created another natural barrier. The Eurotas River flowed through the valley, providing water for agriculture. This geography gave Sparta natural defences that other Greek cities lacked. An invading army would have to cross difficult mountain passes to reach the Spartan heartland. This geographic isolation had profound effects on Spartan development. while coastal cities like Athens and Corinth became trading powers, connecting with the wider Mediterranean world and absorbing influences from Egypt, Phoenicia, and beyond, Sparta remained relatively cut off. The Spartans developed a deep suspicion of foreign influences and foreign ideas. They believed that contact with outsiders would corrupt their way of life. This attitude would persist throughout Spartan history. The climate of the Eurotas Valley was typically Mediterranean, with hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. The soil was fertile enough to support agriculture, particularly the growing of barley, olives, and grapes. However, the Spartans themselves did not farm. That work fell to the Helots, the conquered population who worked the land while the Spartans trained for war. This arrangement freed the Spartan citizens from productive labour, but also created a constant tension at the heart of their society. The name Sparta itself may derive from a word meaning scattered or sown, perhaps referring to the way the settlement was originally spread across several villages rather than concentrated in a single urban centre. Unlike Athens with its magnificent Acropolis, or Corinth with its impressive fortifications, Sparta never developed into a proper city in the architectural sense. The ancient writer Thucydides noted that if Sparta were ever abandoned and only its ruins remained, future generations would never believe it had been a great power. There were no grand temples, no massive walls, no impressive public buildings. The Spartans put their resources into their army, not their architecture. This lack of physical grandeur was deliberate. The Spartans believed that a city's walls were its men, not stones. They were famously one of the only major Greek cities to lack defensive walls throughout most of their history. This was both a practical statement and a philosophical one. Practically, it demonstrated confidence in their military supremacy. Philosophically, it reinforced the idea that Spartans must always be ready to fight in the open field, that they could not rely on fortifications to protect them. The Spartan attitude toward wealth was equally distinctive. While other Greeks accumulated riches and displayed them proudly, the Spartans officially despised wealth. Their currency was deliberately made impractical. Instead of gold or silver coins like other Greek states used, Sparta employed iron bars that were so heavy and of so little value that accumulating significant wealth became nearly impossible. A fortune in Spartan currency would require a warehouse to store and a wagon to transport. This system discouraged trade and commerce while promoting equality among citizens. Yet we should not imagine that Sparta was some kind of communist utopia. There were significant inequalities within Spartan society. Some families held more land than others. Some citizens were more influential than others. The equality that Sparta promoted was primarily an equality among the warrior class. The full Spartan citizens, known as Spartiates or homioi, meaning equals or peers. Below them existed several other classes with fewer rights and privileges. The Spartans were also deeply religious, perhaps more so than other Greeks. They consulted oracles before major decisions, observed religious festivals with great seriousness, and believed that the gods directly influenced human affairs. This religiosity sometimes affected their military campaigns. On more than one occasion, Spartan armies delayed their march or refused to fight because religious observances required them to wait. The most famous example came during the Persian invasion of 480 BCE, when the Spartans initially sent only a small force to Thermopylae because a religious festival prevented the full army from marching. Religion in Sparta centered on several deities, but none more important than Apollo. The Spartans considered themselves particularly devoted to this god of light, music, and prophecy. They also honoured Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, and maintained a famous sanctuary to her at a place called Orthia, where young Spartans underwent painful endurance rituals. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, received worship as well, as did the divine twins Castor and Pollux, who were believed to have been born in Sparta itself. The Spartans traced their lineage back to the legendary hero Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules. This was not merely a matter of pride, but had political implications. The Spartan kings claimed direct descent from Heracles, which gave their rule a divine sanction. The Dorian Greeks, of which the Spartans were a part, all claimed Heraclean ancestry, but the Spartans took this connection more seriously than most. Music and poetry did exist in early Sparta, contrary to the image of Spartans as completely uncultured warriors. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, Sparta was actually known as a centre of music and the arts. Poets like Tyrtaeus and Alcman composed works that were famous throughout Greece. Tyrtaeus wrote martial poetry designed to inspire courage in battle, while Alcman created choral songs for religious festivals. However, as Spartan society became increasingly militarized, artistic pursuits faded in importance. By the classical period, Sparta produced almost nothing in the way of art or literature. The Spartan way of speaking became legendary in its own right. They were famous for using as few words as possible, a style we now call laconic after Laconia, their homeland. When Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, threatened Sparta with the message, "If I enter Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground," the Spartans reportedly replied with a single word, "if." This economy of speech was considered a virtue. Spartans believed that excessive talking was a waste of time and a sign of weakness. Actions, not words, defined a person. This laconic style extended to all aspects of communication. Spartan mothers reportedly told their sons departing for war to return with your shield or on it, meaning either victorious or dead. Surrender was not an option. Throwing away one's shield to flee was the ultimate disgrace. The shield was not just personal protection, but part of the phalanx formation that protected the man standing next to you. To abandon your shield was to abandon your comrades. The Spartans also had a dark sense of humour that emerged in their brief statements. When a visitor from Athens boasted about the long walls protecting his city, a Spartan supposedly replied, "Fine walls for women to live behind." When another Greek complained that Spartan swords were too short, a Spartan answered, "We get close enough to our enemies." These responses encapsulated the Spartan worldview: courage, directness, and contempt for anything that seemed soft or cowardly. Yet for all their reputation as grim warriors, the Spartans did know how to enjoy themselves in certain ways. They held regular festivals with music, dancing, and feasting. Their religious celebrations could be quite elaborate. Young men and women participated in athletic competitions and choral performances. The Spartans simply believed that these activities should serve the state rather than individual pleasure. Dancing made better soldiers. Music built community spirit. Athletic competition prepared young people for the rigours of warfare. The Spartans were also famous for their red cloaks, which became a symbol of their identity. Warriors wore these distinctive garments into battle, making them immediately recognisable on the battlefield. The colour red was chosen, according to some ancient sources, because it would not show blood, and thus would not give enemies the satisfaction of seeing Spartan wounds. Whether or not this explanation is accurate, the red cloak became synonymous with Spartan identity. Hair was another important marker of Spartan manhood. Adult male citizens wore their hair long, carefully groomed and oiled. This was the opposite of the practice in many other Greek cities, where short hair was more common for adult men. The Spartans saw their long hair as a mark of freedom and status. Only free men had the leisure to maintain such elaborate hairstyles. Before battle, Spartans would carefully comb and arrange their hair. a ritual that both prepared them psychologically and demonstrated their calm confidence in the face of death. Women in Sparta occupied a unique position compared to their counterparts elsewhere in Greece. While Athenian women were largely confined to the home, rarely seen in public, and given little education, Spartan women exercised outdoors, received physical training, and had significant control over household affairs. This was not feminism in any modern sense. The purpose was to produce strong mothers who would bear strong sons. But the practical effect was that Spartan women had more freedom and visibility than women anywhere else in the Greek world. Spartan women could own property, which was unusual for ancient Greece, because so many men died in warfare, and because women outlived men on average. Over time, a significant portion of Spartan land ended up in female hands. By some estimates, women eventually controlled as much as 40% of Spartan property. This economic power gave them influence that women elsewhere could only dream of. The Spartans were also known for their distinctive approach to childhood. While other Greeks might indulge their children, the Spartans began toughening them from infancy. Babies were bathed in wine rather than water, supposedly to strengthen them. Children were not swaddled tightly, as was common elsewhere, but were allowed to move freely. They were not comforted when they cried or frightened of the dark. From the earliest age, Spartans were being prepared for a hard life. All of these elements combined to create a society unlike any other in the ancient world. The Spartans were not merely warriors. They were a people who had organized their entire existence around the principle that military excellence was the highest good. Every custom, every tradition, every social arrangement served this central purpose. The result was a community that could field an army of terrifying effectiveness, but that also contained the seeds of its own eventual decline. To truly understand how Sparta became Sparta, we must go back to the beginning, to the murky origins of this remarkable people in the centuries before recorded history. The story of Sparta's founding is wrapped in myth and legend, but beneath the tales of gods and heroes, we can discern the outlines of actual historical events. Let us now journey back through time to explore how Sparta came to be. The origins of Sparta reach back into the Bronze Age, to a time when the great Mycenaean civilization dominated Greece. This was the age of heroes that Homer would later immortalize in his epic poems. The age of Agamemnon and Achilles, of the Trojan War and the wanderings of Odysseus. In this distant era, the region that would become Sparta was already inhabited, already significant, but it was not yet the Sparta of legend. Archaeological evidence tells us that the Eurotas Valley was occupied during the Mycenaean period, roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE. The remains of a Mycenaean palace have been found at a site called the Menelaeon, just across the river from where Sparta would later stand. This palace was associated in Greek tradition with Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose wife Helen was abducted by Paris of Troy, sparking the legendary Trojan War. Whether Menelaus was a real historical figure or purely mythological remains debated, but the palace ruins confirm that this region was an important centre during the Bronze Age. The Mycenaean civilization collapsed around 1100 BCE in a catastrophe that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean. Cities were destroyed, trade networks collapsed, writing was forgotten, and populations declined dramatically. Greece entered a period historians call the Dark Age, lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE. During this time, much of the knowledge and culture of the Bronze Age was lost. When Greece emerged from this darkness, it was a very different place. According to Greek tradition, it was during this Dark Age that the Dorians arrived in the Peloponnese. The Dorians were one of the major ethnic groups of ancient Greece, distinguished from the Ionians and Aeolians by their dialect and customs. Ancient Greeks believed that the Dorians had invaded from the north, conquering the earlier inhabitants and establishing themselves as rulers. Modern scholars debate whether this was truly an invasion or a more gradual migration and cultural shift. What is clear is that by the time Greece emerged from the Dark Age, Dorian Greeks dominated the Peloponnese, including the region of Laconia. The Spartans themselves told a specific story about their origins. They claimed to be descendants of Heracles, the greatest of Greek heroes. According to this tradition, Heracles' descendants, called the Heraclidae, had been driven out of the Peloponnese by the descendants of Pelops, who gave the peninsula its name. Several generations later, the Heraclidae returned with the Dorian Greeks to reclaim their ancestral lands. This return of the Heraclidae was how the Spartans explained and justified their conquest of Laconia. The legend stated that 3 brothers led this return: Temenus, Cresphontes, and Aristodemus. They divided the Peloponnese among themselves by lot. Temenus received Argos, Cresphontes received Messenia, and Aristodemus was to receive Laconia. However, Aristodemus died before the division was complete, so his twin sons, Eurysthenes and Procles, inherited his share. These twins became the founders of the 2 royal houses that would rule Sparta throughout its history. This is why Sparta uniquely had 2 kings at all times, one from each royal line. The 2 royal families were called the Agiads and the Eurypontids, named after early kings in each line. The Agiads claimed descent from Eurysthenes, and the Eurypontids from Procles. Ancient sources sometimes disagreed about which brother was older and which line was more senior, but both families maintained their position throughout Spartan history. This dual kingship was one of the most distinctive features of the Spartan constitution. The actual settlement of Sparta probably occurred gradually over several centuries. The site was not a single unified city, but rather a collection of villages that eventually merged. Ancient sources mention 4 original villages, later joined by a 5th. These were Pitana, Messoa, Limne, Cynosura, and later Amyclae. Amyclae was located a few miles south of the other villages and may have been an independent community that was absorbed into Sparta at a later date. The fact that Sparta remained a collection of villages rather than developing into a proper urban centre may explain its unusual character. The early Spartans, like other Greeks of the Dark Age, lived relatively simple lives. They were farmers and herders, organised into aristocratic families that traced their lineages back to heroic ancestors. The kings had religious and military functions but were not absolute rulers. Power was shared among the leading families. This was not yet the rigidly organised military society that Sparta would become. That transformation would come later, driven by the pressures of conquest and the need to control a subject population. The process by which Sparta became Sparta began with expansion. The Eurotas Valley, while fertile, was not large enough to support a growing population. The Spartans looked to their neighbours for additional land. Their first major conquest was the region of Laconia itself. The earlier inhabitants of this region, who were not Dorians, were reduced to a subordinate status. Some became perioikoi, meaning dwellers around, who were free but not citizens. Others became helots, a servile class bound to the land. The word helot may derive from a Greek word meaning captive, or it may come from the name of a town called Helos that the Spartans conquered. The origins of the term are debated, but the institution itself was clear enough. Helots were not slaves in the typical Greek sense. They were not bought and sold as individuals. Instead, they were bound to specific plots of land and passed down with that land from generation to generation. They worked the farms that supported Spartan citizens, giving up a fixed portion of their produce. In return, they kept whatever surplus they could generate. The Helot system freed Spartan citizens from agricultural labour, allowing them to devote themselves entirely to military training. But it also created a permanent security problem. The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters and had every reason to resent their condition. The threat of Helot rebellion hung over Sparta constantly. This threat shaped Spartan society in profound ways. The Spartans needed to maintain constant military readiness, not primarily to fight foreign enemies, but to keep their own subject population under control. The conquest of Laconia was only the beginning. In the 8th century BCE, the Spartans turned their attention westward to the fertile plains of Messenia. This region, separated from Laconia by the towering Taygetus Mountains, was one of the richest agricultural areas in Greece. Its conquest would transform Sparta from a regional power into the dominant force in the Peloponnese. The First Messenian War, traditionally dated to around 743 to 724 BCE, was a brutal conflict that lasted nearly 20 years. The Messenians resisted fiercely, and the war strained Spartan resources to the limit. According to tradition, it was during this war that the poet Tyrtaeus composed his martial verses, urging the Spartans to stand firm and fight bravely. His poetry gives us a glimpse into the Spartan mindset of this period, with its emphasis on courage, endurance, and the glory of dying for one's city. The war ended with Spartan victory. The Messenians were reduced to Helot status, their land divided among Spartan citizens. This conquest roughly doubled the territory under Spartan control and dramatically increased the Helot population. The Spartans now ruled over a subject population that may have outnumbered them by 7 to 1 or more. The security problem that had existed with the Laconian Helots was now magnified enormously. The Messenians did not accept their fate quietly. Around 685 BCE, they rose in revolt in what became known as the Second Messenian War. This conflict was even more desperate than the first. The Messenians found a hero in Aristomenes, a warrior whose exploits became legendary. According to tradition, Aristomenes was captured 3 times by the Spartans and escaped each time. He was said to have raided Sparta itself and dedicated a shield in the temple of the Messenian god. The Second Messenian War pushed Sparta to the brink. At one point, the Spartans were so desperate for manpower that they promised freedom and citizenship to Helots who would fight. The children born from unions between Spartan women and these Helot soldiers were called Partheniae, and they would later be sent to found the colony of Tarentum in southern Italy. The war revealed how vulnerable Sparta was to internal revolt and how dependent on military strength for survival. The eventual Spartan victory in the Second Messenian War around 668 BCE came at enormous cost, but it also provided the impetus for the transformation of Spartan society. The Spartans realized that they could not maintain control over such a large and hostile subject population through normal means. They needed to become something different, something harder, something more militarily focused than any Greek state had ever been. The answer came in the form of a comprehensive reform of Spartan society, attributed to a legendary lawgiver named Lycurgus. Before we explore the Lycurgan reforms, we should note that the early history of Sparta is shrouded in uncertainty. The dates given for the Messenian Wars are traditional rather than firmly established. The details come from sources written centuries after the events they describe. The Spartans themselves kept few written records, preferring oral tradition. Later Greek writers, fascinated by Spartan society, sometimes projected later practices back into earlier periods. We must treat the early history of Sparta as a mixture of genuine tradition and later elaboration. What we can say with confidence is that something dramatic happened in Sparta during the 7th century BCE. The Spartans transformed themselves from a relatively normal Greek community into the highly militarized society that would become famous throughout the ancient world. Whether this transformation happened all at once or gradually Whether it was the work of one lawgiver or many, the result was unmistakable. By the 6th century BCE, Sparta had become recognizably the Sparta of legend. The geography of Messenia helps explain why the Spartans were so determined to conquer and hold it. Unlike the enclosed Eurotas Valley, Messenia opened onto the sea through several good harbours. Its plains were among the most fertile in Greece, watered by the Pamissos River. Control of Messenia gave Sparta an agricultural surplus that could support a large military establishment. Losing Messenia would have been catastrophic. The Spartans also expanded in other directions, though less dramatically. To the north they conquered the region of Cynuria, which gave them access to the eastern coast of the Peloponnese. They fought repeatedly with Argos, the other major Dorian power in the Peloponnese, for control of this territory. A famous battle at a place called the Battle of Champions, around 546 BCE, saw 300 warriors from each side fight to determine control of the disputed region. According to tradition, only 3 men survived, 2 Argives and 1 Spartan. The Argives claimed victory because they had more survivors, but the Spartan, named Othryades, refused to leave the field and eventually died of his wounds after setting up a trophy of victory. The dispute was settled by a subsequent battle in which Sparta prevailed. Relations with Argos remained hostile throughout Spartan history. The 2 cities were natural rivals, both claiming leadership of the Dorian Greeks, both seeking dominance in the Peloponnese. Sparta eventually won this competition decisively, reducing Argos to a secondary power. But Argos never accepted Spartan supremacy and remained a thorn in Sparta's side, always ready to ally with Sparta's enemies. The island of Cythera, off the southern coast of Laconia, also came under Spartan control. This island had strategic importance as a potential landing point for any naval power seeking to attack Laconia. The Spartans garrisoned it carefully, though they were never a naval power themselves. Their strength lay on land, not at sea. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Sparta controlled most of the southern Peloponnese directly, and dominated the rest through a network of alliances. This alliance system, later known as the Peloponnesian League, bound most of the states of the Peloponnese to Sparta through treaties that required them to follow Spartan leadership in war. The League was not a democracy of equals. Sparta made the decisions, and the allies followed. But it gave Sparta access to military resources far beyond what its own citizen population could provide. The creation of this alliance system was one of Sparta's greatest achievements. It allowed a relatively small citizen body to project power across Greece and beyond. When Sparta went to war, it did not fight alone. It called upon Corinth, Tegea, Elis, and dozens of other states to contribute troops. This multiplied Spartan strength enormously. The Peloponnesian League would remain the foundation of Spartan power for over 2 centuries. The origins of Sparta thus combined several elements: the Dorian migration that brought Greek-speaking peoples to the Peloponnese, the gradual merger of villages into a single community, the conquest of Laconia and Messenia that created the Helot system, and the development of the alliance network that extended Spartan influence. All of these factors contributed to making Sparta what it became. But the crucial transformation, the creation of the unique Spartan way of life, was attributed to one man, the lawgiver Lycurgus. His reforms would shape every aspect of Spartan society and create the warrior culture that made Sparta famous throughout the ages. Lycurgus is one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history. The Spartans credited him with creating their entire way of life, their laws, their customs, their military system, everything that made Sparta unique. Yet we cannot be certain that he ever existed as a historical person. He may have been a real lawgiver whose achievements were later exaggerated. He may have been a mythical figure onto whom the Spartans projected the origins of their institutions. He may have been a god worshipped as a hero. The ancient Greeks themselves were uncertain about Lycurgus, and modern scholars remain divided. The ancient biographer Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, composed a life of Lycurgus that remains our most detailed source, but Plutarch himself admitted the difficulties. He wrote that nothing could be said about Lycurgus that was not disputed. Different sources gave different accounts of his family, his travels, his reforms, and even the era in which he lived. Dates proposed for Lycurgus ranged over several centuries. Some placed him in the 9th century BCE, others in the 7th. This uncertainty suggests that Lycurgus was more legend than history. Despite these problems, the reforms attributed to Lycurgus were real enough. Something transformed Spartan society, and the Spartans themselves believed that Lycurgus was responsible. For our purposes, we can discuss the Lycurgan system, while acknowledging that it may have developed gradually over time, rather than being created by a single lawgiver. According to tradition, Lycurgus was a member of one of the royal families who served as regent for a young king. He was troubled by the disorder and inequality in Spartan society, and travelled widely to study the laws of other peoples. He visited Crete, whose institutions influenced Sparta significantly. He may have visited Egypt, Ionia, and other lands. Eventually, he returned to Sparta with a comprehensive plan for reform. Before implementing his changes, Lycurgus consulted the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred prophetic site in Greece. The oracle confirmed that his laws were good and would make Sparta the most famous city in the world. Armed with this divine approval, Lycurgus returned to Sparta and began his work. The first and most fundamental reform was the redistribution of land. According to tradition, Lycurgus divided the territory of Laconia and Messenia into equal lots, called kleroi, which were distributed to Spartan citizens. Each lot was supposed to produce enough barley and other products to support a citizen and his family. The lots were worked by helots and could not be sold or divided. This system was designed to create economic equality among citizens and prevent the accumulation of wealth that had caused strife in other Greek cities. Whether this land redistribution actually happened as described is doubtful. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that there were always significant inequalities in Spartan landholding. Some families possessed more and better land than others. Over time, land became concentrated in fewer hands as some families died out and their lots were absorbed by others. But the ideal of equality remained important to Spartan ideology, even if the reality fell short. The second major reform concerned currency. Lycurgus supposedly abolished gold and silver coinage and replaced it with iron bars of little value. These iron spits, called oboloi, were heavy and inconvenient. A significant sum would require a cart to transport. This made trade with foreigners difficult and discouraged the accumulation of wealth. It also isolated Sparta economically from the rest of Greece, reinforcing Spartan self-sufficiency and suspicion of outsiders. Again, the reality was more complex than the tradition suggests. Sparta did use iron currency, but this may have been a survival of earlier practices rather than a deliberate reform. Other Greek states also used iron currency in early times before adopting precious metals. And despite the official disdain for wealth, Spartans found ways to accumulate riches, particularly through land and livestock. The Spartan kings were notably wealthy, and some citizens were clearly richer than others. The political reforms attributed to Lycurgus established the framework of Spartan government that would persist for centuries. At the top were the two kings, one from each royal house. Below them was a council of elders called the Gerousia, consisting of the two kings plus 28 men over the age of 60, elected for life. The citizen assembly, called the Apella, included all full citizens, and had the power to approve or reject proposals, but not to debate them. Finally, 5 officials called ephors were elected annually and held enormous power, including the ability to put even kings on trial. This mixed constitution was much admired in antiquity. It combined elements of monarchy in the kings, oligarchy in the Gerousia, and democracy in the Apella. The philosopher Aristotle praised it as a balanced system that avoided the extremes of pure monarchy, pure aristocracy, or pure democracy. The checks and balances prevented any single element from becoming too powerful. The social reforms of Lycurgus were perhaps the most radical. He organised all male citizens into common messes called syssitia or fiditia. Every citizen was required to belong to a mess and to eat his meals there rather than at home. The messes were groups of about 15 men who dined together daily, sharing simple food and building bonds of fellowship that would serve them in battle. Membership in a mess was required for full citizenship. A man who could not afford the required contributions lost his citizen status. The common meals served several purposes. They promoted equality by ensuring that all citizens ate the same food. They built solidarity among men who would fight side by side. They reduced the influence of family and home, subordinating private life to public duty. And they kept men away from their wives, which the Spartans believed made marriages more passionate and produced stronger children. The food served at the common meals was deliberately simple. The most famous dish was black broth, a soup made from pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. Non-Spartans who tasted it found it revolting. One visitor reportedly said that after trying the black broth, he understood why Spartans were so willing to die in battle. Life held few pleasures when this was dinner, but the Spartans viewed the simplicity of their diet as a virtue. Elaborate food was for soft people. Warriors needed sustenance, not luxury. Each member of a mess contributed a set amount of barley, wine, cheese, figs, and money for meat. The contributions were equal regardless of wealth, reinforcing the principle of equality among citizens. A man who fell behind in his contributions would be expelled from the mess and lose his citizenship. This happened to some Spartans who lost their land or fell on hard times. They became known as inferiors, men who had once been full citizens but had lost their status. The messes also served as the basic unit of military organisation. Men who ate together fought together. They knew each other intimately, understood each other's strengths and weaknesses, and had built bonds of trust over countless shared meals. In battle, they would stand side by side in the phalanx, each man's shield protecting the man to his left. The loyalty forged in the mess hall translated directly to effectiveness on the battlefield. Women were excluded from the common meals, as they were from most aspects of public life. But Spartan women had their own gatherings and their own forms of community. They exercised together, competed in athletic events, and formed bonds with other women that paralleled the bonds among men. The separation of the sexes was more complete in Sparta than in other Greek cities, but both sexes had their own spheres of activity. The reforms attributed to Lycurgus also regulated marriage and reproduction. Spartans married later than other Greeks, typically in their mid-20s for men and late teens for women. This was believed to produce stronger children. On the wedding night, the bride would have her hair cut short and would dress in men's clothing. She would wait alone in a dark room for her husband to come to her. He would spend only a brief time with her before returning to his barracks. This strange ritual may have been designed to ease the transition from the all-male world of the barracks to heterosexual relations. For years after marriage, Spartan men continued to live in the barracks with their mess companions. They visited their wives only secretly at night. A man might father several children before he ever saw his wife in daylight. This arrangement was supposed to keep passion alive and prevent the domesticating influence of family life from softening warriors. It also meant that children were raised primarily by their mothers, with fathers as distant figures who appeared occasionally. The Spartans practiced a form of eugenics that shocked other Greeks. Newborn infants were examined by elders of the tribe. Those judged healthy and well-formed were allowed to live. Those deemed weak or deformed were taken to a place called the Apothetai, a chasm on Mount Taygetus, and left to die. The Spartans believed that it was better for the child and for the state if weak individuals did not survive. Only the strong should reproduce and pass on their qualities to the next generation. Modern scholars debate how commonly this practice actually occurred. Some argue that it was more ideology than reality, a story the Spartans told about themselves to emphasize their toughness. Archaeological evidence of infant exposure is limited, but the fact that the Spartans claim this practice as their own tells us something about their values. They wanted to be seen as a people who prioritized strength and fitness above sentiment. Lycurgus was also credited with establishing the Agoge, the famous Spartan system of education and training that we will explore in detail in the next section. This system took boys from their families at age 7 and subjected them to years of rigorous physical and mental conditioning. It was the foundation of Spartan military excellence and one of the most distinctive features of Spartan society. The reforms extended to dress and appearance. Spartans were required to wear simple clothing, avoiding bright colours and elaborate decoration. The only exception was the famous red cloak worn by warriors. Luxury in dress was seen as a sign of moral weakness. Similarly, houses were required to be built using only axes and saws, without fine craftsmanship. The doors and roofs of Spartan homes were deliberately rough. A man who lived in such a house would be ashamed to fill it with expensive furniture or decorations. Lycurgus supposedly banned written laws, believing that the law should live in the hearts of citizens rather than on tablets. This explains why we have no Spartan law code comparable to those of other Greek cities. The Spartans transmitted their customs orally from generation to generation. This made their system flexible in some ways, but also conservative, as any change could be portrayed as a departure from ancestral tradition. According to tradition, once Lycurgus had established his reforms, he made the Spartans swear an oath not to change the laws until he returned from a journey. He then travelled to Delphi, consulted the oracle one final time, and received confirmation that Sparta would flourish as long as it kept his laws. Rather than return and release the Spartans from their oath, Lycurgus starved himself to death. His self-sacrifice ensured that his laws would remain in force forever. This story, whether true or not, illustrates the Spartan attitude toward their institutions. They believed their way of life was divinely sanctioned and should never be changed. Innovation was dangerous. The ancestors had established the perfect system, and any deviation would lead to decline. This conservatism made Sparta remarkably stable for centuries, but also made it difficult for Sparta to adapt when circumstances changed. The Lycurgan system created a society unlike any other in the ancient world. Every aspect of life was regulated in service of the state. Individual desires were subordinated to collective needs. The family was weakened in favour of the community. Wealth was despised, at least officially. Military excellence was the highest virtue. The result was a community that could produce warriors of extraordinary quality, but that sacrificed much of what other Greeks valued: art, philosophy, commerce, individual freedom. The system also created enormous pressures. The requirements for citizenship were demanding. A man had to complete the Agoge, be accepted into a mess and maintain his contributions throughout his life. Failure at any point meant loss of status. The number of full citizens, the Spartiates, was never large, perhaps 9,000 at most in the early period. Over time, this number declined as men failed to meet the requirements or as family lines died out. By the 4th century BCE, the number of Spartiates had fallen to perhaps 1,000. This demographic decline would eventually doom Sparta. But in the centuries after the reforms, Sparta reached the height of its power. The Lycurgan system produced generation after generation of superb soldiers. Sparta became the acknowledged leader of Greece in military matters. Other Greeks might mock Spartan simplicity and Spartan ignorance of culture, but they respected and feared Spartan arms. When danger threatened, Greeks looked to Sparta for leadership. The system worked, at least for a time. The reforms attributed to Lycurgus transformed Sparta from an ordinary Greek city into something extraordinary. They created a warrior culture that has fascinated people ever since. They also created a rigid system that contained the seeds of its own destruction. But that destruction lay centuries in the future. For now, we must examine the institution that stood at the heart of the Spartan system, the Agoge, the brutal and effective training program that turned Spartan boys into Spartan warriors. The word Agoge means raising or leading, and it referred to the comprehensive system of education and training that every Spartan male underwent from childhood to adulthood. The Agoge was not merely schooling, it was a complete transformation of the individual, designed to produce citizens who would place the state above all else and who would fight with unmatched skill and courage. No other Greek city had anything comparable. The Agoge was uniquely Spartan, and it was the foundation of Spartan military supremacy. The process began at birth or even before. Spartan women were expected to exercise and stay healthy so they would bear strong children. Pregnant women were encouraged to think brave thoughts, to look at images of heroes, to do everything possible to influence the character of the child in the womb. The Spartans believed that the qualities of the parents and even their mental state during conception and pregnancy would be transmitted to the offspring. When a child was born, as we have discussed, it was examined by tribal elders. Only those judged fit were allowed to survive. A child who passed this initial inspection was bathed in wine, which the Spartans believed would strengthen it. Unlike other Greek children, Spartan infants were not swaddled tightly. They were allowed to move freely, to develop their limbs without constraint. They were not comforted when they cried or frightened of the dark. From the earliest age, they were being prepared for hardship. For the first 7 years of life, Spartan children remained at home with their mothers. This was the only period when family life took precedence over state demands. Mothers taught their children basic values: courage, obedience, endurance. Boys learned that crying was shameful, that fear was weakness, that a Spartan must always be brave. Girls learned that they must be strong to bear strong sons. Even in these early years, the state's influence was felt. At age 7, everything changed. Boys were taken from their homes and enrolled in the Agoge. They would not return to live with their families until they were 30 years old, and even then, they would spend most of their time with their mess companions. For the next 23 years, the state would be their family, their barracks, their home, their fellow trainees, their brothers. The boys were organised into groups called herds or packs, supervised by older boys and young men. They lived in dormitories, sleeping on beds of reeds that they gathered themselves from the riverbank. They were given minimal clothing, a single cloak that had to serve for all seasons. They went barefoot year-round, regardless of weather. They were given just enough food to survive, but not enough to be satisfied. Hunger was a constant companion. The deliberate underfunding was not cruelty for its own sake. It served several purposes. It toughened the boys physically, accustoming them to the hardships they would face on campaign. It taught them self-reliance, as they were expected to supplement their rations through foraging and theft. And it created a permanent state of want that could only be satisfied through success in training and eventually in battle. Theft was not merely tolerated in the Agoge, it was encouraged. Boys were expected to steal food to supplement their meagre rations. However, getting caught was severely punished. The lesson was not that stealing was acceptable, but that a warrior must be cunning and stealthy. A soldier who could steal food from under the enemy's nose without being detected would be invaluable on campaign. The famous story of the Spartan boy who stole a fox and hid it under his cloak illustrates this principle. When questioned by an adult, the boy denied having anything. The fox, concealed beneath his cloak, gnawed at his belly. The boy endured the pain without flinching and died rather than admit his theft. He was praised for his endurance and his commitment to concealment. Whether this story is literally true matters less than what it reveals about Spartan values. Endurance of pain was considered the highest virtue. A Spartan who showed pain, who cried out, who flinched, was disgraced. The Agoge systematically trained boys to suppress their natural reactions to pain and fear. They were beaten regularly, sometimes for cause and sometimes simply to accustom them to physical punishment. They learned to take blows without reaction, to endure cold, heat, hunger, and exhaustion without complaint. The most famous example of this pain endurance came at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Here, young Spartans underwent a ritual called the diamastagosis, the flogging contest. Boys were whipped at the altar of the goddess while trying to steal cheeses that had been placed there. The one who endured the most lashes, or who stole the most cheeses despite the beating, was honoured. Some boys died under the lash rather than give up. In later centuries, this ritual became a tourist attraction, with visitors coming from across the Roman Empire to watch Spartan youth as being flogged. Physical training was constant and varied. Boys learned to run, jump, throw the javelin and discus, wrestle and fight. They swam in the cold waters of the Eurotas River. They marched long distances carrying heavy loads. They practiced with weapons until their use became instinctive. Every activity was designed to build strength, endurance, and combat skills. But the Agoge was not purely physical. Boys also received intellectual training, though of a distinctly Spartan kind. They learned to read and write, but only enough for practical purposes. They memorized the poetry of Tyrtaeus and other martial verses that celebrated courage and condemned cowardice. They studied the laws and customs of Sparta, learning what was expected of a citizen. They practiced the laconic style of speech, learning to express themselves in as few words as possible. Music and dance were important parts of the curriculum. The Spartans believed that music trained the soul just as exercise trained the body. Boys learned to sing in chorus, to move in formation, to keep time with their companions. These skills transferred directly to the battlefield, where soldiers needed to march in step, maintain formation, and respond to commands given by trumpet or voice. The famous Spartan war dances, performed before battle, were both religious rituals and practical warm-ups. The training also emphasized obedience and hierarchy. Boys learned to respect their elders, to obey commands instantly, to accept their place in the social order. Any adult Spartan citizen had the right to discipline any boy. If a boy misbehaved, any man who witnessed it could punish him. This created a sense that the entire community was responsible for raising the young, and that the young owed obedience to the entire community. Competition was built into every aspect of the Agoge. Boys competed against each other in athletics, in mock battles, in endurance contests. They competed for the approval of their trainers and the older boys who supervised them. They competed for positions of leadership within their age groups. This constant competition weeded out the weak and identified the strong. It also created rivalries that could persist into adulthood, though the shared experience of the Agoge also created bonds that transcended competition. At certain ages, boys underwent particularly significant transitions. Around age 12, they entered a phase of more intensive training. Their hair was cut short, and they received even less food and clothing. They were assigned to an older youth, typically in his late teens, who served as a mentor and role model. This relationship, called the Plataea, had educational, emotional, and sometimes physical dimensions. The older youth was responsible for the younger boy's development and would be shamed if his charge failed. The nature of these relationships has been much discussed by scholars. Ancient sources suggest that they often had a romantic or sexual component, as was common in many Greek educational contexts. The Spartans apparently believed that such bonds strengthened military cohesion. Men who loved each other would fight harder to protect each other. However, the Spartans also claimed that their relationships were more restrained than those in other Greek cities, focused on the soul rather than the body. The truth is difficult to determine from our sources. At age 18, Spartan males entered a transitional phase. They were no longer boys, but not yet full citizens. They served as supervisors for younger boys, learning leadership by practicing it. They also began more advanced military training, learning to fight in formation with the full equipment of a hoplite warrior. Some were selected for the Plataea, a secret service that we will discuss shortly. The Plataea was one of the most controversial aspects of the Spartan system. Young men selected for this service were sent out into the countryside, armed only with daggers. They hid during the day and emerged at night to hunt helots. Any helot found outside after dark could be killed. The Plataea served multiple purposes. It gave young Spartans experience in stealth, survival, and killing. It terrorized the helot population, reminding them of their subjection, and it identified potential troublemakers among the helots, who might be eliminated before they could cause problems. The philosopher Aristotle condemned the Plataea as cruel and unjust. Modern readers are likely to agree. The systematic murder of subject peoples is difficult to justify by any ethical standard, but the Spartans saw it differently. They viewed the helots as enemies, as a conquered population that would rebel if given the chance. The Plataea was a form of ongoing warfare, keeping the enemy cowed and the warriors sharp. It was brutal, but the Spartans were not trying to be kind. At age 20, Spartan males became eligible for election to a mess and for full military service. If accepted into a mess, they became members of the Spartan army and could be called upon to fight. However, they still lived in barracks and were not yet full citizens. They could marry, but could not live with their wives. They were warriors first, husbands and fathers second. Full citizenship came at age 30. At this point, a Spartan male could finally live in his own home, though he still ate his meals at the common mess. He could participate in the assembly, voting on matters of war and peace. He could hold public office. He had completed his transformation from boy to citizen, from individual to Spartan. The entire process took 23 years, from age 7 to age 30. During this time, the state shaped every aspect of a young man's development. His body was hardened through constant exercise and deprivation. His mind was trained to think in Spartan ways. His loyalties were transferred from family to state, from individual to community. He learned to fight, to endure, to obey, and to lead. He became, in short, a Spartan. The results were impressive. Spartan soldiers were recognized throughout Greece as the finest warriors in the world. They were stronger, better trained, more disciplined, and more cohesive than any other army. They fought in formation with a precision that other Greeks could not match. They did not break and run when battles turned against them. They stood and died rather than retreat. This reputation was well earned, built on the foundation of the Agoge. But the system had costs. The Agoge was brutal, and not all boys survived it. Those who could not meet its demands were cast out, losing their chance at citizenship. The constant competition created psychological pressures that some could not bear. The separation from family weakened bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives. The emphasis on conformity left little room for individuality or creativity. The system also produced a narrow kind of excellence. Spartans were superb soldiers, but little else. They produced almost no art, literature, philosophy, or science. They contributed nothing to the intellectual achievements of ancient Greece. While Athenians were developing democracy, writing tragedies, building the Parthenon, and debating the nature of justice, Spartans were drilling in formation and practicing with their weapons. The Agoge created warriors, but it did not create complete human beings. Furthermore, the system was fragile. It depended on a sufficient number of boys completing the training and being accepted into messes. As the citizen population declined, the Agoge could not produce enough warriors to maintain Spartan power. The very system that made Sparta strong contained mechanisms that would eventually make it weak. But for centuries the Agoge worked. It produced the soldiers who would face the Persian Empire at Thermopylae, who would defeat Athens in the Peloponnesian War, who would dominate Greece for generations. The Agoge was the engine of Spartan power, and understanding it is essential to understanding Sparta itself. The training of warriors was only one part of Spartan society, however. The Agoge produced soldiers, but those soldiers existed within a larger social context. They had families, owned property, participated in government, and interacted with various classes of people who were not full citizens. To understand Sparta fully, we must examine this broader society, its classes, its women, its subject populations, and its daily life. Spartan society was rigidly hierarchical, divided into distinct classes with different rights, obligations, and ways of life. At the top stood the Spartiates, the full citizens who had completed the Agoge and been accepted into a mess. Below them were several other groups, the Perioikoi, free inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, who were not citizens, the Helots, the servile population who worked the land, and various intermediate categories of people who had lost full citizen status or who had gained partial rights. Understanding these social divisions is essential to understanding how Sparta functioned. The Spartiates, also called homioi, or equals, were the elite of Spartan society. Only they had full political rights. Only they could vote in the assembly, hold office, or serve in the elite units of the army. They were forbidden from engaging in trade or manual labour, which were considered beneath their dignity. Their sole occupation was warfare. They trained constantly, served when called, and devoted their lives to military excellence. The number of Spartiates was never large and declined over time. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, Sparta fielded 5,000 Spartiates. By the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the number had fallen to perhaps 1,000. This decline had many causes: deaths in battle, failure to meet the requirements for citizenship, extinction of family lines, and the concentration of land in fewer hands. As the citizen body shrank, Sparta's military power diminished proportionally. The requirements for Spartiate status were demanding. A man had to be descended from Spartiate parents, complete the Agoge successfully, be elected to a mess, and maintain his contributions to the mess throughout his life. Failure at any point meant loss of status. A man who could not afford his mess contributions became an inferior, retaining some rights but losing full citizenship. A man who showed cowardice in battle became a trembler, subject to public humiliation and social exclusion. The inferiors were a growing class as Sparta's history progressed. Economic inequality, despite the official ideology of equality, meant that some families prospered while others declined. Land, though supposedly inalienable, found ways to change hands. Wealthy families accumulated multiple lots, while poorer families lost theirs. By the 4th century BCE, the concentration of wealth had become severe, with most land owned by a small number of families, many of them headed by women. Below the Spartiates came the Perioikoi, whose name means dwellers around. These were free Greeks who lived in the towns and villages of Laconia and Messenia, but were not Spartan citizens. They had their own local governments and managed their own affairs, but they had no say in Spartan policy and were required to serve in the Spartan army when called. They could not intermarry with Spartiates, and their status was hereditary. The perioikoi performed essential functions that Spartiates could not. They engaged in trade and commerce, connecting Sparta to the wider Greek economy. They practiced crafts, producing the weapons, armour, pottery, and other goods that Sparta needed. They worked as merchants, sailors, and artisans. Without the perioikoi, the Spartan economy could not have functioned, since Spartiates were forbidden from such occupations. The relationship between Spartiates and perioikoi was complex. The perioikoi were not slaves or serfs. They were free people with property rights and legal protections. But they were clearly subordinate to the Spartiates, required to follow Spartan leadership and contribute to Spartan wars. They seem to have accepted this arrangement, perhaps because it offered security and stability. Revolts by perioikoi were rare, unlike the frequent Helot uprisings. The perioikoi may have numbered several times the Spartiate population. They provided the majority of the troops in Spartan armies, fighting as hoplites alongside the Spartiates. In battle, they were organised in their own units, but served under Spartiate officers. Their military contribution was essential to Spartan power, especially as the number of Spartiates declined. At the bottom of Spartan society were the Helots, the servile population who worked the land. The Helots were not slaves in the typical Greek sense. They were not bought and sold as individuals. They were not foreigners captured in war. They were the descendants of the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, conquered by the Spartans and reduced to permanent servitude. They were bound to the land, passing their status to their children, generation after generation. The Helots worked the farms that supported Spartiate families. Each Spartiate household was assigned a number of Helots who cultivated its land. The Helots kept a portion of the harvest for themselves and gave the rest to their masters. The amount they owed was fixed by custom, so if they could produce a surplus beyond this amount, they could keep it. Some Helots apparently accumulated modest wealth, though they could never escape their servile status. The treatment of Helots varied. Some masters were relatively benign, treating their Helots decently in exchange for loyal service. Others were brutal, using violence and terror to maintain control. The Spartan state itself institutionalized violence against Helots through practices like the Plataea. Every year, the ephors formally declared war on the Helots, making it legally permissible to kill them without penalty. The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartiate masters, perhaps by ratios of 7 to 1 or more. This demographic reality shaped everything about Spartan society. The Spartans lived in constant fear of Helot rebellion. Their military training, their social organisation, their reluctance to send armies far from home all reflected this fear. The Spartans were not primarily preparing to fight foreign enemies. They were primarily preparing to suppress their own subject population. Helot revolts did occur, most notably after earthquakes or military disasters weakened Spartan power. The Great Earthquake of 464 BCE killed thousands of Spartans and triggered a massive Helot uprising that took years to suppress. The Messenian Helots were particularly restive, never fully accepting their subjugation. When Sparta was finally defeated at Leuctra in 371 BCE, the Thebans liberated Messenia, and the Messenians established their own independent state. The loss of Messenia and its Helots was a blow from which Sparta never recovered. Between these major classes existed various intermediate categories. The Mothakes were boys of non-Spartiate origin who were raised alongside Spartiates in the Agoge, sometimes as companions to Spartiate boys. They could achieve a status similar to citizenship, but were never fully equal. The Neodamodeus were Helots who had been freed for military service, granted land, and a status above other Helots, but below Perioikoi. The Hypermeones, or inferiors, were former Spartiates who had lost their status. These categories provided some social mobility, but also highlighted the rigidity of the basic class structure. Women occupied a unique position in Spartan society. Compared to women elsewhere in Greece, Spartan women had remarkable freedom. They received physical education, exercising outdoors in ways that scandalized other Greeks. They could own and inherit property, eventually controlling a significant portion of Spartan wealth. They spoke their minds freely, even to men. They were expected to be tough, brave, and patriotic, producing sons for the state and encouraging them to fight bravely. The physical training of Spartan women served reproductive purposes. The Spartans believed that strong, healthy women would bear strong, healthy children. Girls exercised, competed in athletics, and developed their bodies just as boys did, though they did not undergo the full Agoge. They ran, wrestled, threw the javelin, and competed in foot races. They performed these activities wearing minimal clothing, or none at all, which shocked visitors from other Greek cities. Spartan women married later than women elsewhere, typically in their late teens rather than early teens. This was believed to produce healthier offspring. The marriage ritual, as we have discussed, was unusual, with the bride dressed as a man and waiting in darkness. The husband would visit briefly and then return to his barracks. This pattern continued for years, with the couple meeting only secretly at night. The result was that Spartan women ran their households with minimal male supervision. While their husbands lived in barracks and ate at common messes, women managed the home, raised the children, and controlled the family property. They had authority over slaves and helots. They made decisions that women in other Greek cities could not make. Their economic power and social visibility made them exceptional in the ancient world. Spartan women were famous for their sharp tongues and their fierce patriotism. The saying, "with your shield or on it," was attributed to Spartan mothers, meaning that a son should return victorious or dead, never having thrown away his shield in flight. When a woman was asked why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, she supposedly replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." These sayings may be legendary, but they capture the Spartan ideal of womanhood. Strong, proud, and devoted to the state, the property rights of Spartan women had significant consequences over time. Because women could own land and because they tended to outlive men who died in battle, wealth gradually accumulated in female hands. By the 4th century BCE, women owned perhaps 40% of Spartan land. This concentration of wealth in fewer families contributed to the decline in citizen numbers, as fewer men could meet the property requirements for citizenship. Daily life in Sparta revolved around the rhythms of training, meals, and military service. For Spartiate men, the day began early with exercise and drill. They trained with weapons, practiced formation movements, and built their strength and endurance. The morning might include hunting, which the Spartans valued as preparation for war. Then came the midday meal at the common mess, followed by more training or public duties. The evening meal was also taken at the mess, after which men might visit their families briefly before returning to sleep in the barracks. This routine continued throughout a Spartiate's adult life. Even men over 60, who were no longer required to serve in the field army, remained connected to their messes and participated in community life. The elderly were respected in Sparta, serving on the Gerousia if elected, and providing guidance to younger generations. Age brought honour rather than marginalisation. Religious observances punctuated the calendar. The Spartans celebrated numerous festivals throughout the year, honouring various gods and marking seasonal transitions. The Carnia, held in late summer, was one of the most important, honouring Apollo with music, dancing, and athletic competitions. The gymnopaedia featured naked dancing by young men in the summer heat, demonstrating their endurance. The Hyacinthia honoured a youth beloved by Apollo, combining mourning and celebration over 3 days. These festivals were not merely religious obligations. They reinforced community bonds, provided entertainment, and showcased Spartan values. The athletic competitions demonstrated physical excellence. The choral performances displayed discipline and coordination. The religious rituals connected the community to the gods who protected it. Even leisure in Sparta served the state. Entertainment in Sparta was limited compared to other Greek cities. There was no theatre, no elaborate symposia, no philosophical discussions. The Spartans distrusted such activities as corrupting influences. They did enjoy music, but music of a martial character. They appreciated poetry, but poetry that celebrated courage and condemned cowardice. They valued wit, but the laconic wit of brief, cutting remarks rather than elaborate rhetoric. Hunting was a favoured pastime for those with leisure. The Spartans hunted boar, deer, and other game in the mountains surrounding their valley. Hunting taught skills useful in warfare, tracking, stealth, endurance, and the courage to face dangerous animals. It also provided meat to supplement the diet. Spartan kings were particularly associated with hunting, leading expeditions that combined recreation with leadership display. The Spartans also enjoyed athletic competition, though they were ambivalent about the great Pan-Hellenic games at Olympia, Delphi, and elsewhere. In early times, Spartans dominated these competitions, winning more victories than any other city. But as Spartan society became more militarized, participation declined. The Spartans came to view individual athletic glory as potentially corrupting, drawing men away from their duty to the state. By the classical period, few Spartans competed in the major games. The Spartan diet was simple but adequate. Barley was the staple grain, supplemented by cheese, figs, and wine. Meat was relatively rare, reserved for special occasions and religious sacrifices. The famous black broth provided protein and calories in an unappetizing package. The Spartans did not suffer from malnutrition, but they did not indulge in culinary pleasures either. Clothing was equally simple. The single cloak given to boys in the Agoge remained the standard garment for adults. Spartans did not wear elaborate clothing or jewelry. They took pride in their simplicity, viewing luxury as weakness. The red cloak worn in battle was their one concession to display, and even that served practical purposes. Housing in Sparta was modest. The requirements that houses be built with only axes and saws meant that Spartan homes lacked the refinements found elsewhere. There were no marble columns, no elaborate decorations, no fine furniture. The Spartans believed that simple surroundings produced simple, virtuous people. A man who lived in a rough house would not develop soft habits. This description of Spartan daily life applies primarily to the Spartiate class. The Perioikoi and Helots lived very differently. Perioikoi, in their towns and villages, led lives more similar to other Greeks, engaging in trade and craft production, raising families in normal households, and enjoying whatever pleasures their means allowed. Helots worked the land from dawn to dusk, living in conditions that varied from tolerable to brutal, depending on their masters. The Spartan system rested on the labour of these subordinate classes, whose daily lives were far removed from the military routine of the Spartiates. The social structure of Sparta was designed to produce and maintain military excellence. Every element served this purpose. The Spartiates trained for war. The Perioikoi provided economic support and additional troops. The Helots worked the land, freeing citizens from labour. Women bore and raised children who would become soldiers. The entire society was a machine for producing warriors. But this machine required constant maintenance. The social divisions created tensions that could erupt into violence. The Helots threatened rebellion. The inferiors resented their loss of status. The concentration of wealth undermined the ideology of equality. The declining citizen population weakened military strength. Sparta's social system was impressive but fragile, and its weaknesses would eventually prove fatal. Having examined Spartan society, we must now turn to Spartan government. How was this unique society organized politically? Who made decisions, and how were they made? The Spartan constitution was as distinctive as everything else about Sparta, and understanding it helps us understand how Sparta functioned as a state. The Spartan constitution was famous in antiquity as a model of balanced government. It combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in a system that provided stability for centuries. Ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle studied it carefully, and later political thinkers drew lessons from it. The Roman Republic, with its consuls, senate, and popular assemblies, may have been influenced by Spartan models. Understanding Spartan government helps us understand not only Sparta, but the development of political thought in the Western tradition. At the apex of the Spartan system stood the two kings, one from each of the royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. This dual kingship was unique in Greece and perhaps in the entire ancient world. No other state had two kings ruling simultaneously, each with equal authority, each checking the power of the other. The origins of this arrangement were lost in legend, traced back to the twin sons of Aristodemus, who had divided the inheritance of Laconia between them. The two kings were not absolute monarchs. Their powers were limited and specific. In peacetime, they served primarily as religious leaders, performing sacrifices on behalf of the state and maintaining the relationship between Sparta and the gods. They presided over certain legal cases, particularly those involving family matters such as adoptions and the marriages of heiresses. They received special honours at public meals and festivals. They were treated with great respect, standing when others sat, receiving double portions of food, and being mourned with elaborate funerals when they died. In wartime, the kings came into their own. They served as commanders of the army, leading Spartan forces into battle. Originally, both kings might campaign together, but after a disastrous incident when the two kings disagreed during a campaign, a law was passed requiring one king to remain in Sparta, while the other led the army. The king on campaign had absolute authority over military matters. He could make tactical decisions, negotiate with enemies, and discipline soldiers without interference. On the battlefield, the king was supreme. The kings also had important judicial functions. They served as judges in certain types of cases and had the power to adopt children into families, which had significant implications for inheritance and citizenship. They appointed officials called Pythioi, who consulted the oracle at Delphi on behalf of the state. They kept the oracular responses, which were considered state secrets of great importance. Despite these powers, the kings were far from all-powerful. They could be put on trial by the ephors, and several kings were deposed, exiled, or even executed during Spartan history. They were required to swear an oath each month to rule according to the laws, while the ephors swore to support them as long as they kept their oath. This mutual oath-taking symbolized the limited nature of royal power. The relationship between the two kings was often tense. They came from rival families with long histories of competition. Personal animosities could flare into open conflict. Some of the most dramatic episodes in Spartan history involved clashes between the two kings or between a king and his colleagues' supporters. The dual kingship provided a check on royal power but also created potential for division and intrigue. Succession to the kingship followed a specific pattern. The throne passed to the eldest son, born after the father became king, not necessarily the eldest son overall. This rule was designed to ensure that the heir was born to a reigning king, presumably conceived with the special qualities that kingship conferred. In practice, succession disputes were common, with different claimants arguing about who qualified under the rules. The Gerousia and ephors often had to adjudicate these disputes. The Gerousia, or Council of Elders, was the second major institution of Spartan government. It consisted of the 2 kings plus 28 men over the age of 60, elected for life. The Gerousia was the most powerful body in Sparta, setting the agenda for the assembly, judging serious crimes including those carrying the death penalty, and advising on all matters of state policy. Election to the Gerousia was considered the highest honour a Spartan could achieve. Candidates had to be over 60 years old and of good reputation. The election process was unusual. Candidates appeared before the assembly one by one in an order determined by lot. As each candidate appeared, the assembled citizens shouted their approval. Judges, seated in a nearby building where they could hear but not see, determined which candidate received the loudest acclamation. This method, which Aristotle called childish, was designed to prevent bribery and ensure that the most popular candidates won. Once elected, a gerent served for life. This gave the Gerousia great stability, but also meant that its members were often very old, sometimes too old to participate effectively. The minimum age of 60 meant that even new members were elderly by ancient standards. Critics argued that the Gerousia was dominated by men whose best years were behind them, who might be susceptible to bribery or manipulation, and who could not be removed no matter how poorly they performed. The Gerousia had several crucial functions. It prepared all business that came before the assembly. No matter could be voted on unless the Gerousia had first considered it and formulated a proposal. This gave the elders enormous control over the political agenda. They could prevent issues from ever reaching the assembly simply by refusing to propose them. By the classical period, the ephors had become the dominant force in Spartan government. They initiated policy, controlled information, and wielded day-to-day power that exceeded that of the kings or the Gerousia. Foreign states dealt with the ephors rather than the kings when conducting diplomacy. The ephors decided when to mobilize the army and how to respond to crises. Their one-year term prevented any individual from accumulating too much power, but the office itself was supremely powerful. The combination of these institutions created a government of checks and balances. The kings checked each other. The Gerousia checked the assembly. The ephors checked the kings. No single individual or institution could dominate. This balance produced remarkable stability. Sparta avoided the cycles of tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy that afflicted other Greek cities. For centuries, the Spartan constitution remained essentially unchanged. Ancient observers admired this stability. The philosopher Plato, disgusted by the chaos of Athenian democracy, looked to Sparta as a model of orderly government. Aristotle analysed the Spartan constitution in detail, praising its balance while noting its flaws. Later thinkers, including the framers of the American Constitution, studied ancient Sparta as an example of mixed government. But the Spartan constitution had significant weaknesses. The concentration of power in the ephorate created potential for abuse. Because ephors served only 1 year and could not be re-elected, they might pursue short-term policies without regard for long-term consequences. Unscrupulous ephors could manipulate the system for personal or factional advantage. The annual change of ephors also made policy inconsistent, as each new board might reverse the decisions of its predecessors. It was rarely used, perhaps because the assembly rarely made decisions that the elite opposed, but its existence demonstrated the limits of popular power. The most powerful officials in Sparta were the 5 ephors, whose name means overseers. The ephors were elected annually by the assembly, one from each of the 5 villages that made up Sparta. Any citizen could be elected ephor and no one could hold the office twice. This made the ephorate the most democratic element of the Spartan constitution, accessible to ordinary citizens rather than reserved for the elite. The powers of the ephors were extraordinary. They presided over meetings of the assembly. They could summon and question any citizen, including the kings. They conducted foreign policy, receiving ambassadors and negotiating treaties. They supervised the Agoge, ensuring that young Spartans were properly trained. They declared the annual war on the Helots, legitimizing violence against the servile population. They could fine, imprison, or bring to trial anyone who violated Spartan law or custom. The ephors served as a check on royal power. 2 ephors accompanied the king on campaign, watching his conduct and reporting back to Sparta. The ephors could prosecute kings for misconduct, and several kings were tried and punished during Spartan history. The monthly exchange of oaths between kings and ephors symbolized this relationship. The kings swore to rule according to law. The ephors swore to support the kings as long as they kept their oath. The origin of the ephorate was debated even in antiquity. Some sources attributed it to Lycurgus, making it part of the original constitution. Others said it was created later, perhaps by a king named Theopompus, who wanted to limit royal power and prevent tyranny. The latter tradition suggests that the ephorate was added to balance the constitution, introducing a popular element to check the monarchical and aristocratic elements. By the classical period, the ephors had become the dominant force in Spartan government. They initiated policy, controlled information, and wielded day-to-day power that exceeded that of the kings or the Gerousia. Foreign states dealt with the ephors rather than the kings when conducting diplomacy. The ephors decided when to mobilize the army and how to respond to crises. Their 1-year term prevented any individual from accumulating too much power, but the office itself was supremely powerful. The combination of these institutions created a government of checks and balances. The kings checked each other. The Gerousia checked the assembly. The ephors checked the kings. No single individual or institution could dominate. This balance produced remarkable stability. Sparta avoided the cycles of tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy that afflicted other Greek cities. For centuries, the Spartan constitution remained essentially unchanged. Ancient observers admired this stability. The philosopher Plato, disgusted by the chaos of Athenian democracy, looked to Sparta as a model of orderly government. Aristotle analysed the Spartan constitution in detail, praising its balance while noting its flaws. Later thinkers, including the framers of the American Constitution, studied ancient Sparta as an example of mixed government. But the Spartan constitution had significant weaknesses. The concentration of power in the ephorate created potential for abuse. Because ephors served only 1 year and could not be re-elected, they might pursue short-term policies without regard for long-term consequences. Unscrupulous ephors could manipulate the system for personal or factional advantage. The annual change of ephors also made policy inconsistent, as each new board might reverse the decisions of its predecessors. The Gerousia, for all its prestige, was vulnerable to corruption. Elderly men serving for life, with no possibility of removal, might be bribed or manipulated. Aristotle specifically criticized the Gerousia on these grounds, arguing that even virtue can decay with age, and that lifetime tenure was a mistake. The election process, based on shouting, was easily manipulated and did not necessarily select the most qualified candidates. The dual kingship, while providing a check on royal power, also created potential for conflict. When the two kings disagreed, the state could be paralysed. Personal rivalries between the royal houses could poison politics for generations. Some of Sparta's worst crises occurred when the kings worked against each other rather than together. The assembly, despite being theoretically sovereign, had little real power. Ordinary citizens could vote but not debate. They could approve or reject but not propose. The elite controlled the agenda and could override popular decisions. This was democracy in name only, a far cry from the participatory democracy of Athens, where any citizen could speak and propose legislation. The Spartan constitution also excluded the majority of the population from any political role. Perioikoi, helots, women, and non-citizens had no voice in government. The assembly represented only adult male Spartiates, a small fraction of the total population. Sparta was not a democracy in any meaningful sense, but an oligarchy, ruled by the few over the many. Despite these weaknesses, the Spartan constitution functioned effectively for centuries. It provided the framework within which Spartan society operated, the structure that organized political life and resolved disputes. It was admired throughout Greece and beyond, studied by philosophers and imitated by other states. The stability it provided allowed Sparta to focus its energies on military excellence, building the army that would make Sparta famous. The government of Sparta was inseparable from its military system. The kings were generals. The ephors supervised military training and mobilized the army. The Gerousia advised on military policy. The assembly voted for war and peace. Every institution was oriented toward the central purpose of Spartan society, the creation and deployment of military power. To understand Sparta fully, we must now examine that military system in detail, exploring how the Spartans fought and why they were so effective on the battlefield. The Spartan army was the most feared military force in ancient Greece. For centuries, no Greek state could match Spartan soldiers in open battle. The very sight of Spartans in their red cloaks, advancing in perfect formation with their shields locked together, was enough to break the morale of many opponents. This military supremacy was not accidental. It was the product of a society organized entirely around the production of warriors, a training system that began in childhood and continued throughout life, and a tactical system refined over generations of warfare. The foundation of Greek warfare in the classical period was the hoplite, a heavily armed infantry soldier named after his large round shield, the hoplon or aspis. The hoplite carried a shield about 3 feet in diameter, made of wood covered with bronze, with a distinctive double grip that allowed it to be held on the left arm. He wore a bronze helmet that protected his head and face, a bronze breastplate or cuirass that protected his torso, and bronze greaves that protected his shins. He carried a long, thrusting spear, typically 7 to 9 feet in length, as his primary weapon, and a short sword for close combat. This equipment was heavy, perhaps 50 to 70 pounds in total. It was also expensive, which meant that only citizens with sufficient wealth could afford to serve as hoplites. In most Greek cities, the hoplite class was the middle class, farmers and craftsmen who could afford their own equipment. In Sparta, all citizens were hoplites, their equipment provided from the surplus produced by Helot labour. Hoplites fought in a formation called the phalanx, a dense mass of soldiers arranged in ranks and files. The soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create a wall of bronze. Each man's shield protected not only himself, but also the right side of the man standing next to him. This created a powerful incentive to maintain formation. A man who stepped out of line endangered his neighbour. A man who fled endangered everyone. The phalanx advanced as a unit, moving in step to the rhythm of pipes or drums. When it met the enemy phalanx, the two formations crashed together in a violent collision. The soldiers in the front ranks thrust with their spears, trying to find gaps in the enemy's shield wall. The soldiers behind them pushed forward, adding their weight to the pressure on the enemy line. The battle became a shoving match, a test of strength and endurance, until one side broke and fled. This style of warfare favoured discipline, cohesion, and physical strength over individual heroics. The best warrior in the world was useless if he broke formation. The phalanx succeeded or failed as a unit. This made training and drill essential. Soldiers needed to march in step, maintain their positions, and respond to commands instantly. They needed to trust the men beside them and be trusted in return. The Spartans excelled at phalanx warfare because their entire society was designed to produce soldiers who could fight this way. The Agoge trained boys from childhood to endure hardship, obey commands, and work as part of a team. The common messes built bonds between men who would fight side by side. The constant drilling of adult citizens created muscle memory that functioned even in the chaos of battle. Spartan soldiers were organized into units based on age and locality. The basic unit was the Enomotia, a platoon of about 36 men commanded by an enomotarch. 4 Enomotiae formed a Pentacostis of about 144 men. 4 Pentacostes formed a Lokos of about 576 men. The exact organization varied over time and is not entirely clear from our sources, but the principle of hierarchical organization remained constant. Command was exercised through a clear chain of authority. The king commanded the army as a whole. Below him, Polmarchs commanded the major divisions. Below them, Lochagoi commanded the Lokoi, and so on down to the Enomotarchs. Orders flowed down this chain and were obeyed instantly. Spartan soldiers did not question commands or debate tactics. They executed orders with the precision that came from years of training. The Spartans performed complex maneuvers that other Greek armies could not match. They could wheel their formation, changing direction while maintaining order. They could extend or contract their line, adjusting to the terrain or the enemy's deployment. They could execute a fighting retreat, falling back in good order while continuing to face the enemy. They could even feign flight, pretending to run away to draw the enemy out of formation, then turning suddenly to counterattack. This last maneuver was extremely dangerous and required absolute confidence in one's comrades. Only the Spartans could execute it reliably. The Spartans also understood the psychology of battle. They advanced slowly and steadily, singing hymns to the gods, projecting calm confidence while their enemies grew increasingly nervous. They did not rush into battle with wild war cries like other Greeks. Their discipline was itself a weapon, unnerving opponents who expected the chaos of normal combat. The sight of the Spartan phalanx advancing in perfect order, red cloaks fluttering, spear points gleaming, was designed to break enemy morale before contact was even made. Before battle, the Spartans performed religious rituals. The king sacrificed to the gods and examined the entrails of the sacrificial animals for omens. If the omens were unfavourable, the army might delay its advance or even withdraw. This was not mere superstition, but a way of managing the psychological state of the army. Soldiers who believed the gods favoured them fought with greater confidence. Soldiers who feared divine displeasure might hesitate at crucial moments. The Spartans also had specific pre-battle customs. They combed and oiled their long hair, preparing for death with the same care they would prepare for a festival. They ate a good meal, knowing it might be their last. They checked their equipment and tightened their armour. They embraced their comrades and spoke words of encouragement. These rituals built cohesion and focused minds on the task ahead. In battle, the Spartans typically held the position of honour on the right wing. In Greek warfare, the right wing was considered the most prestigious and dangerous position. Because each soldier's shield protected his left side, the rightmost soldiers in a phalanx were the most exposed. Armies tended to drift to the right during battle, as each soldier unconsciously sought the protection of his neighbour's shield. This meant that the right wing often outflanked the enemy's left. The Spartans, as the best soldiers in any allied army, claimed the right wing as their due. The Spartan king fought in the front ranks, surrounded by a bodyguard of 300 elite soldiers called the Hepes, or Knights. Despite the name, these were not cavalry, but the finest infantry, selected for their courage and skill. They protected the king and formed the spearhead of Spartan attacks. The presence of the king in battle inspired the soldiers and provided visible leadership at the point of greatest danger. If a king fell in battle, his body was recovered at all costs. The Spartans believed that a king's body must not fall into enemy hands. They would fight with desperate fury to retrieve a fallen king, and this determination sometimes turned near defeats into victories. The body of King Leonidas at Thermopylae was the subject of intense fighting, with the Spartans eventually recovering it from the Persians. The Spartans were also notable for their treatment of victory and defeat. After winning a battle, they did not pursue the fleeing enemy with the savage enthusiasm of other Greeks. They believed that killing men who were running away was beneath their dignity. They would pursue far enough to ensure the enemy was truly routed, then halt and return to strip the dead and care for their own wounded. This restraint was partly practical, preventing the disorder that pursuit caused, and partly ideological, reflecting Spartan values of discipline and self-control. Defeat was harder to handle. Spartans were expected to die rather than surrender. The famous injunction to return with your shield or on it captured this expectation. A soldier who threw away his shield to flee was permanently disgraced. A soldier who surrendered was equally shamed. The small number of Spartans who did surrender, such as the 120 who gave up at Sphacteria in 425 BCE, were stripped of their citizenship and became social outcasts. The Spartan army included more than just Spartiates. Perioikoi served as hoplites, fighting in their own units but under Spartiate command. Their contribution was essential, especially as the number of Spartiates declined. Helots served as light-armed troops and servants, carrying equipment, preparing camps, and sometimes fighting as skirmishers. Each Spartiate might be accompanied by several Helots on campaign. Over time, the Spartans also employed freed Helots, called Neodamodeus, as regular soldiers. These men received land and a status above other Helots in exchange for military service. They helped fill the gaps left by the declining Spartiate population. By the 4th century BCE, Neodamodeus and other non-Spartiates formed the majority of Spartan armies. The Spartans were primarily a land power and never developed significant naval capabilities. Their geography, surrounded by mountains and lacking good harbours, did not encourage seafaring. Their social system, which required citizens to train constantly for land warfare, left no time for naval skills. When Sparta needed a navy, it relied on allies, particularly Corinth, or hired ships and crews from elsewhere. This naval weakness was a significant limitation. In the Persian Wars, Sparta contributed soldiers but relied on Athens for naval power. In the Peloponnesian War, Sparta eventually built a fleet, but only with Persian financial support, and largely using non-Spartan crews. The final defeat of Athens came at sea, at Agoge in 405 BCE, but the victory was won by a Spartan admiral named Lysander, using a fleet that was Spartan in name only. Spartan tactics evolved over time, though the basic phalanx system remained constant. The Spartans learned from their enemies and adapted to new challenges. After suffering losses to Athenian light troops at Sphacteria, they developed better methods for dealing with skirmishers. After their defeat at Leuctra, they attempted reforms to address their declining manpower. But they never fundamentally changed their approach to warfare, and when that approach became obsolete, Spartan military power collapsed. The greatest strength of the Spartan military was also its greatest weakness, its dependence on a small citizen body. The Spartiates were superb soldiers, but there were never enough of them. As their numbers declined, Sparta had to rely increasingly on Perioikoi, Neodamodeus, and mercenaries. These troops were adequate but not exceptional. The Spartan military system could produce the finest individual soldiers in Greece, but it could not produce enough of them to maintain Spartan dominance indefinitely. The Spartan military legacy extended far beyond Greece. The Romans studied Spartan methods and incorporated some elements into their own system. The concept of the professional soldier, trained from youth and devoted entirely to military service, influenced later military thinkers. The Spartan emphasis on discipline, cohesion, and training remains relevant to military organizations today. The Spartans did not invent warfare, but they perfected a particular form of it, and their example has inspired soldiers for more than 2,000 years. With this understanding of Spartan military organization and tactics, we can now turn to the wars that made Sparta famous. The first great test of Spartan power came not against other Greeks, but against the peoples of their own region. The Messenian Wars established Sparta as the dominant power in the Peloponnese and created the Helot system that would shape Spartan society for centuries. Let us examine these foundational conflicts and their consequences. The Messenian Wars were the crucible in which Sparta was forged. These brutal conflicts, spanning generations, transformed Sparta from an ordinary Greek city into the militarized society that would dominate Greece for centuries. The conquest of Messenia gave Sparta the agricultural wealth and labor force it needed to support a professional warrior class. The resistance of the Messenians created the permanent security threat that justified Spartan militarism. Without the Messenian Wars, there would have been no Sparta as we know it. Messenia lay to the west of Sparta, separated by the towering Taygetus mountain range. It was one of the most fertile regions in Greece, blessed with rich soil, adequate rainfall, and the waters of the Parmissos River. Its plains could support a large population and produce surplus grain for export. Control of Messenia would make any Greek state wealthy and powerful. For Sparta, squeezed into the narrow Eurotas Valley, Messenia represented an irresistible prize. The First Messenian War began around 743 BCE, though the exact date is uncertain. Our sources for this conflict are late and legendary, mixing historical events with mythological embellishments. The war was said to have started over a border dispute or an insult to Spartan honour. Whatever the immediate cause, the underlying motivation was Spartan desire for Messenian land. The war lasted approximately 20 years, a brutal generation-long struggle that strained both sides to their limits. The Messenians were not helpless victims, but fierce warriors who defended their homeland with desperate courage. They fortified themselves on Mount Ithome, a natural stronghold in the centre of Messenia, and held out for years against Spartan attacks. According to tradition, it was during this war that the poet Tyrtaeus composed his martial verses. Tyrtaeus was said to have been an Athenian sent to Sparta in response to an oracle, though this story may be legendary. His poetry survives only in fragments, but those fragments give us a vivid picture of Spartan values during this formative period. He celebrated courage and condemned cowardice, urging soldiers to stand firm in the battle line and never retreat. His verses were memorized by Spartan boys for centuries afterward. One famous fragment of Tyrtaeus captures the Spartan ideal. It is a beautiful thing for a brave man to die, falling in the front ranks, fighting for his fatherland. Another describes the shame of cowardice. No one would remember or speak of him, neither his name nor his deeds, but if he survives, he wanders as a beggar, shaming his family and disgracing his noble form. These verses were not mere poetry, but propaganda designed to steel Spartan resolve during the long and costly war. The war ended around 724 BCE with Spartan victory. The Messenians were conquered, their land divided among Spartan citizens, their people reduced to Helot status. The Spartans now controlled a territory roughly twice the size of their original homeland. They had access to some of the best agricultural land in Greece. They had a labour force to work that land, while they devoted themselves to military training. But the conquest created problems, as well as opportunities. The Messenians did not accept their subjugation. They remembered their freedom and passed those memories to their children. They outnumbered their Spartan masters by a significant margin. They waited for an opportunity to rise up and reclaim their homeland. That opportunity came about a generation later, around 685 BCE, when the Messenians launched a massive revolt that became known as the Second Messenian War. This conflict was even more desperate than the first. The Messenians found a hero in Aristomenes, a warrior whose exploits became legendary throughout Greece. Aristomenes was said to have performed feats that bordered on the supernatural. He raided Sparta itself, penetrating to the heart of the enemy city. He was captured 3 times by the Spartans and escaped each time. On one occasion, he was thrown into a pit called the Kaiadas, where the Spartans disposed of criminals and prisoners. He survived the fall and escaped by following a fox through a passage in the rock. Whether these stories are true or not, they demonstrate the impression Aristomenes made on Greek memory. The Second Messenian War pushed Sparta to the brink of destruction. At one point, the Spartans were so desperate for soldiers that they promised freedom and citizenship to Helots who would fight. The children born from unions between Spartan women and these Helot soldiers during the war were called Partheniae, meaning sons of virgins, or perhaps sons of unmarried women. After the war, these Partheniae were denied the citizenship they had been promised. Resentful and dangerous, they were eventually sent away to found a colony at Tarentum in southern Italy. The war also prompted internal reforms in Sparta. The crisis forced the Spartans to reorganize their society for permanent military readiness. This may have been when many of the reforms attributed to Lycurgus actually took place. The common messes, the redistribution of land, the intensification of military training, all of these measures made sense as responses to the near disaster of the Second Messenian War. The war ended around 668 BCE with another Spartan victory, but the cost had been enormous. The Spartans learned that they could never relax their vigilance. The Messenians would rebel again if given the chance. The only way to maintain control was to remain permanently ready for war. This realization shaped everything about classical Sparta. After the Messenian Wars, Sparta consolidated its position in the Peloponnese. The Spartans did not seek to conquer more territory directly. Instead, they built a network of alliances that bound other states to Spartan leadership. This alliance system, later called the Peloponnesian League by modern historians, became the foundation of Spartan power. The Peloponnesian League was not a league of equals. Sparta made the decisions, and the allies followed. Each allied state had a treaty with Sparta, requiring it to have the same friends and enemies as Sparta, and to follow Spartan leadership in war. The allies provided troops when Sparta called, supplementing the relatively small Spartiate army with thousands of additional soldiers. In return, Sparta provided security and stability. The major states of the Peloponnese joined the league, some willingly and some under pressure. Corinth, a wealthy trading city at the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, was an important ally. Plataea, an Arcadian city that had long resisted Spartan expansion, was defeated and brought into the alliance. Elis, which controlled the Olympic Games, joined as well. Only Argos, Sparta's ancient rival, remained outside, nursing its resentment and waiting for opportunities to challenge Spartan dominance. The conquest of Tegea illustrates Spartan methods. The Spartans initially tried to conquer Tegea directly, confident that their military superiority would prevail. They even brought chains with them to bind the Tegeans they expected to capture. Instead, the Spartans were defeated, and the captured Spartans were bound with their own chains and forced to work the Tegean fields. This humiliating defeat taught the Spartans a lesson. They changed their approach, seeking alliance rather than conquest. Eventually, Tegea was brought into the Spartan alliance through diplomacy backed by military pressure. The Peloponnesian League gave Sparta resources far beyond what its own citizen body could provide. When Sparta went to war, it could call upon Corinthians, Tegeans, Mantineans, and soldiers from dozens of other cities. This multiplied Spartan power enormously. A Spartan army might include 5,000 Spartiates, but it would also include tens of thousands of allied troops. The allies fought under Spartan command, following Spartan strategy and tactics. The League also gave Sparta influence over Greek affairs more broadly. When disputes arose between Greek states, they often turned to Sparta for mediation. Sparta's reputation for justice and stability, combined with its military power, made it a natural arbiter. The Spartans cultivated this role, presenting themselves as defenders of order against tyranny and chaos. The 6th century BCE saw Sparta reach the height of its power and prestige. The Spartans intervened repeatedly in the affairs of other Greek states, usually to overthrow tyrants and establish governments friendly to Sparta. They drove the tyrant Hippias out of Athens in 5 or 10 BCE, though they later regretted this when democratic Athens became a rival. They defeated Argos decisively at the Battle of Plataea around 494 BCE, killing so many Argive warriors that Argos was crippled for a generation. By 500 BCE, Sparta was the acknowledged leader of Greece. Its army was unmatched. Its alliance system covered most of the Peloponnese and extended into central Greece. Its reputation for military excellence was unchallenged. Other Greeks might mock Spartan simplicity and Spartan ignorance of culture, but they respected and feared Spartan power. When the greatest threat in Greek history appeared on the horizon, it was to Sparta that the Greeks looked for leadership. That threat came from the east, from the vast Persian Empire that had swallowed up the ancient kingdoms of the Near East and now turned its attention to Greece. The Persian Wars would test Sparta as nothing had before. They would produce the most famous episode in Spartan history, the last stand at Thermopylae, and they would establish Sparta's reputation for all time as the home of the bravest warriors the world had ever seen. The Persian Wars were the defining moment of ancient Greek history. A small collection of independent city-states faced the largest empire the world had ever seen, and against all odds prevailed. The Greeks who fought in these wars became heroes, whose deeds were celebrated for millennia. And no Greeks were more celebrated than the Spartans, whose courage at Thermopylae became the supreme example of military valour. The Persian Empire had been expanding westward for decades. Under Cyrus the Great, Persia had conquered the Median Empire, the Lydian kingdom of Croesus, and the ancient civilization of Babylon. Under his successors, Persia had added Egypt and extended its reach into Central Asia and the Indus Valley. By 500 BCE, the Persian Empire stretched from Libya to India, encompassing dozens of peoples and hundreds of cities. Its resources were virtually unlimited. Its army numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Greek cities of Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor, had been absorbed into the Persian Empire when Cyrus conquered Lydia. These Greeks chafed under Persian rule. In 499 BCE they revolted, supported by Athens and Eretria, 2 cities from mainland Greece. The revolt was eventually crushed, but the Persian king Darius was determined to punish the Greeks, who had dared to interfere in his empire. In 490 BCE, Darius sent an expedition across the Aegean Sea to punish Athens and Eretria and to bring mainland Greece under Persian control. The Persians sacked Eretria and landed at Marathon on the coast of Attica, about 25 miles from Athens. The Athenians sent a runner to Sparta requesting immediate assistance. The Spartans agreed to help, but said they could not march until the full moon, as they were celebrating a religious festival. This delay has been much debated. Some see it as evidence of Spartan religious scrupulousness, their genuine belief that the gods must be honoured even in times of crisis. Others see it as a convenient excuse, a way to let Athens bear the brunt of the Persian attack, while Sparta waited to see how events unfolded. Whatever the motivation, the result was that Athens faced the Persians alone, supported only by a small contingent from the city of Plataea. The Battle of Marathon was an Athenian triumph. The Athenian general Miltiades led his hoplites in a charge against the Persian line, routing the invaders and killing thousands. The Persians fled to their ships, and the expedition withdrew. When the Spartans finally arrived, marching with impressive speed, once the religious festival ended, the battle was already over. They toured the battlefield, praised the Athenians for their victory, and returned home. Marathon was a turning point. It proved that Greek hoplites could defeat Persian soldiers in open battle. It gave the Greeks confidence that resistance was possible, but it was not the end of the Persian threat. Darius began preparing a much larger expedition to avenge the defeat, and when he died in 486 BCE, his son Xerxes inherited both the throne and the determination to conquer Greece. Xerxes spent years assembling the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. Ancient sources give wildly exaggerated numbers, claiming millions of soldiers. Modern historians estimate that the actual force was probably between 100,000 and 300,000 men. Still an enormous army by Greek standards. The Persian force included infantry, cavalry, and a massive fleet. It was a multinational army, drawing soldiers from every corner of the empire. Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Babylonians, Indians, and dozens of other peoples. In 480 BCA, Xerxes led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow straits separating Asia from Europe, using bridges made of boats lashed together. He marched through Thrace and Macedonia, gathering additional forces as he went. Greek states in the north submitted without resistance. The Persian host moved south like a flood, seemingly unstoppable. The Greeks who chose to resist faced a desperate situation. They were vastly outnumbered. They were divided into dozens of independent city-states that had often fought each other. They had no unified command structure, no common strategy, no experience fighting together. Their only advantages were their superior heavy infantry, their knowledge of the terrain, and their determination to remain free. A congress of Greek states met at the Isthmus of Corinth to coordinate resistance. Sparta was recognized as the leader of the alliance, given command of both the army and the navy. This was a remarkable concession from Athens, which had the largest fleet and had already proven itself at Marathon. But the Greeks understood that Spartan leadership was essential. Only Sparta had the military prestige to hold the alliance together. The Greek strategy was to delay the Persian advance at a series of defensive positions, buying time to mobilize more forces and hoping that the Persians would suffer attrition from disease, supply problems, and the difficulty of operating so far from home. The first major defensive position was at Thermopylae, a narrow pass where the mountains came close to the sea, creating a bottleneck that would neutralize Persian numerical superiority. Thermopylae means hot gates, named for the hot springs in the area. The pass was only wide enough for a single wagon to pass through at its narrowest point. A small force could hold this position against a much larger army, at least for a time. The Greeks decided to make their stand here while their fleet engaged the Persian navy at nearby Artemisium. The force sent to Thermopylae was small, far smaller than the situation demanded. Sparta sent only 300 Spartiates, the royal bodyguard of King Leonidas, along with their Helot attendants. Other Greek states contributed additional troops, bringing the total to perhaps 7,000 men. This was a tiny force to face the Persian multitudes, but the Greeks hoped it would be enough to hold the pass until reinforcements arrived. Why did Sparta send so few soldiers? The timing was unfortunate. The Olympic Games and the Spartan festival of Carnea coincided with the Persian advance, and religious law forbade military campaigns during these sacred periods. The Spartans planned to send their full army after the festivals ended. The 300 were an advance guard, meant to stiffen Greek resistance and demonstrate Spartan commitment to the cause. King Leonidas led the Spartan contingent. He was a member of the Agoge royal house, about 60 years old, experienced in war and respected by his peers. According to tradition, he had consulted the oracle at Delphi before marching and received a grim prophecy. Either Sparta would be destroyed or a Spartan king would die. Leonidas understood that he was marching to his death. He chose his 300 accordingly, selecting only men who had living sons to carry on their family lines. The 300 Spartans who marched to Thermopylae knew they were unlikely to return. They were not the youngest or strongest warriors, but mature men in their prime, proven soldiers who understood exactly what they were facing. Their wives and mothers knew it too. When Leonidas departed, his wife Gorgo asked him what she should do. He replied simply, "Marry a good man and bear good children." It was a farewell. The Greeks arrived at Thermopylae before the Persians and prepared their position. They rebuilt an ancient wall that crossed the narrowest part of the pass. They established their camp and waited. When the Persian host arrived, it was a sight that must have been terrifying. A sea of men stretching to the horizon, an army so large that it drank rivers dry. Xerxes waited 4 days before attacking, perhaps expecting the Greeks to flee when they saw his overwhelming numbers. He sent a messenger to demand that the Greeks surrender their weapons. Leonidas gave the famous laconic reply, "Come and take them." The phrase "molon labe" in Greek has echoed through history as a defiant declaration of resistance against impossible odds. On the 5th day, Xerxes ordered the attack. He sent his Median and Sicyan troops forward, confident that they would sweep aside the small Greek force. Instead, they were slaughtered. The narrow pass negated their numerical advantage. The Greeks, fighting in their tight phalanx formation, cut down wave after wave of attackers. The Persians could not bring their numbers to bear. They could only feed men into the meat grinder of the pass. Xerxes then sent his elite troops, the Immortals, 10,000 of the best soldiers in the Persian army. They fared no better. The Greeks held their ground, rotating units to give exhausted soldiers rest, while fresh troops took their place. The Spartans were particularly effective, using a tactic of feigned retreat to draw the Persians forward, then turning suddenly to cut them down. By the end of the first day, Persian casualties were enormous, and the pass remained in Greek hands. The second day was a repeat of the first. Xerxes threw more troops at the Greek position, and more troops died. The Greeks suffered casualties too, but nothing compared to the Persian losses. The pass was choked with bodies. Xerxes reportedly leaped from his throne 3 times in frustration as he watched his army fail to break through. That night, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes came to the Persian camp. He told Xerxes about a mountain path that bypassed Thermopylae, emerging behind the Greek position. This path, called the Anopeia, was known to the Greeks, and they had posted a force of 1,000 Phocians to guard it. But the Phocians were not Spartans. When the Persian Immortals came up the path at dawn on the 3rd day, the Phocians retreated to higher ground, rather than fighting. The path was open. Leonidas learned of the betrayal from scouts and deserters. He understood immediately that the position was lost. The Persians would soon be behind him, and his small force would be surrounded and destroyed. He had a choice: retreat and save his men, or stay and die. The decision Leonidas made has been debated ever since. He dismissed most of the Greek allies, sending them south to safety. He kept only his 300 Spartans, along with 700 Thespians, who refused to leave, and 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was questionable. Perhaps 300 Helots remained as well. With this small force, perhaps 1,400 men, Leonidas prepared to face the entire Persian army. Why did Leonidas stay? Several explanations have been offered. He may have been obeying the oracle, which had said that a Spartan king must die to save Sparta. He may have been covering the retreat of the other Greeks, buying time for them to escape. He may have believed that Spartan honour required him to hold the position he had been assigned, regardless of the cost. He may have calculated that a glorious death would inspire Greek resistance more than a prudent retreat. Perhaps all of these factors played a role. On the morning of the third day, Leonidas led his men out of the defensive wall and attacked the Persians in the wider part of the pass. This was not a defensive stand, but an aggressive assault, a final charge meant to inflict maximum casualties before the end. The Greeks fought with savage fury, knowing they were doomed. When their spears broke, they fought with swords. When their swords broke, they fought with hands and teeth. Leonidas fell early in the fighting, killed by Persian arrows and spears. A fierce struggle erupted over his body. The Greeks determined to recover their king. The Persians determined to take him as a trophy. The Greeks drove the Persians back 4 times before finally securing the body. But by then, the immortals had completed their march over the mountain and were descending on the Greek rear. The surviving Greeks retreated to a small hill within the pass, where they made their final stand. Surrounded on all sides, they fought until the last man fell. The Persians, unwilling to lose more soldiers in close combat, finished them off with arrows. By noon it was over. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and their comrades were dead. The pass was open. The Battle of Thermopylae was a defeat. The Greeks failed to hold the pass, and the Persian army marched on to sack Athens. But it was a defeat that became a victory in memory. The courage of Leonidas and his men inspired all of Greece. The story of the 300 became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, of courage against impossible odds, of duty unto death. The Spartans who died at Thermopylae were buried where they fell. A monument was erected with an epitaph that became one of the most famous in history. "Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their commands." This simple statement captured everything the Spartans valued: obedience, duty, sacrifice. They had been ordered to hold the pass, and they had held it until death. The sacrifice at Thermopylae bought time for the rest of Greece. The Greek fleet, though it failed to stop the Persian navy at Artemisium, survived to fight again. The Athenians evacuated their city before the Persians arrived, saving the population, if not the buildings. The Greek alliance held together, strengthened by the example of Spartan courage. The decisive naval battle came at Salamis, in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland. The Athenian admiral Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the confined waters, where their numbers became a disadvantage. The Greek triremes, more manoeuvrable and better handled, destroyed the Persian fleet. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, saw his naval power broken in a single day. With his fleet destroyed, Xerxes could no longer supply his huge army by sea. He withdrew to Asia, leaving a large force under his general Mardonius to complete the conquest of Greece the following year. The immediate crisis had passed, but the war was not over. In 479 BCE, the Greeks assembled the largest army they had ever fielded to face Mardonius. The Spartans, their religious festivals finally over, marched out in full strength. 5,000 Spartiates took the field, the largest Spartan force ever deployed outside the Peloponnese. They were accompanied by 5,000 perioikoi and 35,000 Helot light troops. Other Greek states contributed additional forces, bringing the total to perhaps 40,000 hoplites and an equal number of light troops. The Greek army was commanded by the Spartan regent Pausanias, who was ruling on behalf of the young son of Leonidas. Pausanias was an able general but a difficult personality, arrogant and ambitious. He would later be accused of treasonous dealings with Persia and would die a sordid death, starved to death in a temple where he had taken sanctuary. But in 479 BCE he led the Greeks to their greatest victory. The two armies faced each other near the town of Plataea in Boeotia. For days they manoeuvred and skirmished without committing to a major battle. Mardonius had cavalry that could harass the Greeks on open ground. The Greeks had superior infantry, but needed to fight in a position where the cavalry could not operate effectively. The stalemate was broken when the Greeks attempted a nighttime withdrawal to a better position and became disorganized in the darkness. Mardonius saw the Greek confusion and ordered an immediate attack. His cavalry swept forward, followed by the Persian infantry. The Greeks were caught in disorder, their units scattered and out of position. It should have been a disaster. But the Spartans held. Pausanias kept his 5,000 Spartiates in formation, refusing to advance until the sacrificial omens were favourable. The Spartans stood under a rain of Persian arrows, suffering casualties, waiting for the signal to attack. Their discipline was extraordinary. Other troops would have charged forward or fled backward. The Spartans simply stood and died, waiting for their commander's order. When the omens finally turned favourable, Pausanias gave the command. The Spartans charged. They smashed into the Persian line with the force of men who had been waiting too long, who had watched their comrades fall around them, who were ready to release their fury. The fighting was savage. The Persians, who had erected a barricade of wicker shields, fought bravely but could not match the Spartans in close combat. Mardonius himself led a counterattack, mounted on a white horse, surrounded by his best troops. He was killed in the fighting, struck down by a Spartan named Arimnestus. With their general dead, the Persian resistance collapsed. The Persian infantry fled to their fortified camp, pursued by the Greeks. The camp was stormed, and the Persian army was destroyed. Of the tens of thousands who had fought that morning, only a fraction escaped. The Battle of Plataea ended the Persian invasion of Greece. Combined with a Greek naval victory at Mycale on the same day, it broke Persian power in the Aegean. The Greeks had won. Against all odds, against the greatest empire in the world, they had preserved their freedom. The Spartans received the greatest honour for the victory at Plataea. They had held the line when others wavered. They had killed Mardonius and broken the Persian centre. They had proven that Thermopylae was no fluke, that Spartan courage was real and decisive. The other Greeks acknowledged Spartan supremacy. For the next 50 years, Sparta was the undisputed leader of Greece. But the Persian wars also planted seeds of future conflict. Athens had provided the fleet that won at Salamis. Athenian leadership had saved Greece when Sparta was slow to act. The Athenians were proud of their contribution and resentful of Spartan dominance. In the years after the Persian Wars, Athens would build an empire of its own, challenging Spartan leadership and setting the stage for the great conflict that would tear Greece apart. The Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was the great catastrophe of ancient Greece, a conflict that lasted 27 years and left the Greek world exhausted and divided. It pitted Sparta and its allies against Athens and its empire in a struggle for dominance that neither side could win decisively. The war ended with Spartan victory, but it was a victory that brought Sparta more problems than benefits. The hegemony that followed was brief and troubled, and within a generation Sparta's power would be broken forever. The roots of the conflict lay in the different paths Athens and Sparta had taken after the Persian Wars. Sparta returned to its traditional isolation, content to dominate the Peloponnese through its alliance system. Athens, by contrast, transformed the alliance that had fought Persia into an empire. The Delian League, originally a voluntary association of Greek states contributing ships and money to continue the war against Persia, became an Athenian-dominated organisation that extracted tribute from its members and crushed any attempt at secession. Athenian power grew rapidly. The Athenians built the long walls connecting their city to its port at Piraeus, making Athens virtually invulnerable to siege as long as it controlled the sea. They accumulated wealth from tribute and trade. They built magnificent temples, including the Parthenon. They developed democratic institutions that gave ordinary citizens unprecedented power. Athens became the cultural and intellectual centre of Greece, home to philosophers, playwrights, artists, and scientists. Sparta watched this growth with increasing alarm. The Athenians were not merely becoming powerful, they were becoming a different kind of power, one based on naval strength, commerce, and democracy rather than land warfare and aristocratic values. The two cities represented fundamentally different visions of Greek civilization. Conflict between them seemed inevitable. The immediate causes of the war were complex, involving disputes over colonies, alliances, and trade. Corinth, Sparta's most important ally, was particularly hostile to Athens, which had been interfering in Corinthian interests. The Corinthians pressured Sparta to act, warning that Athenian power would soon become unstoppable if not checked. Other allies added their voices. Finally, in 432 BCE, the Spartan assembly voted for war. The Spartans sent an ultimatum to Athens, demanding concessions that would have meant the end of Athenian power. The Athenians, led by the statesman Pericles, refused. War began in 431 BCE. The strategies of the two sides reflected their different strengths. Sparta had the finest army in Greece and could devastate Athenian territory at will. But Sparta could not take Athens as long as the long walls stood and Athenian ships controlled the sea. Athens had the most powerful navy and could raid Spartan allied coasts with impunity. But Athens could not defeat the Spartan army in open battle. The war became a stalemate, with neither side able to strike a decisive blow. The Spartans invaded Attica every year, burning crops and destroying farms. The Athenian population crowded behind the long walls, safe but suffering. In 430 BCE, a devastating plague struck Athens, killing perhaps a quarter of the population, including Pericles himself. The plague was a disaster that Spartan arms could never have achieved, weakening Athens at a critical moment. Despite the plague, Athens fought on. Athenian ships raided the Peloponnese, attacking Spartan allies and demonstrating that Sparta could not protect its own. The war dragged on year after year, with victories and defeats on both sides, but no resolution. Both sides grew exhausted. In 421 BCE, they agreed to a peace treaty, the Peace of Nicias, that was supposed to last 50 years. The peace lasted barely 6. Neither side was satisfied with the terms, and both continued to maneuver for advantage. Athens launched a massive expedition against Syracuse, a powerful Greek city in Sicily, allied with Sparta. The Sicilian expedition was a catastrophe. The entire Athenian force, over 40,000 men and 200 ships, was destroyed. Athens never recovered from this blow. Sparta seized the opportunity. With Persian financial support, the Spartans built a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval supremacy. A brilliant Spartan admiral named Lysander took command and proved to be one of the most effective leaders in Spartan history. Lysander was unconventional by Spartan standards, willing to use deception, bribery, and political manipulation to achieve his goals. He was not beloved, but he was effective. In 405 BCE, Lysander caught the Athenian fleet at anchor at Agoge on the Hellespont. The Athenians were careless, their ships beached, their crews scattered. Lysander attacked suddenly and destroyed almost the entire fleet, capturing most of the ships and executing thousands of prisoners. Athens was now defenceless, its lifeline to the grain supplies of the Black Sea severed. Lysander sailed to Athens and blockaded the city by sea, while Spartan armies blockaded it by land. Cut off from food supplies, the Athenians starved. In 404 BCE they surrendered. The long walls were torn down to the sound of flute music, the Spartans celebrating the end of Athenian power. Athens was forced to give up its fleet, its empire, and its democratic government. An oligarchy friendly to Sparta, the 30 Tyrants, was installed. Sparta had won the Peloponnesian War. It was now the undisputed hegemon of Greece, the dominant power in a world it had remade. But victory brought problems that Sparta was ill-equipped to handle. The first problem was what to do with the former Athenian Empire. Sparta had fought the war ostensibly to liberate the Greeks from Athenian tyranny, but the Spartans quickly proved to be worse masters than the Athenians had been. Spartan governors, called harmosts, were installed in former Athenian subject cities. These governors were often corrupt and brutal, extracting wealth for themselves and imposing Spartan-style oligarchies on populations that preferred democracy. The 30 tyrants in Athens were particularly notorious. They executed political opponents, confiscated property, and terrorized the population. Within a year, the Athenians rose up and overthrew them, restoring democracy. Sparta, distracted by other problems, did not intervene effectively. Athens was weakened but free, and it would never forgive Sparta for the 30 tyrants. The second problem was Persia. Sparta had won the war with Persian gold, but that gold came with strings attached. The Spartans had promised to return the Greek cities of Asia Minor to Persian control. This was a betrayal of everything the Greeks had fought for in the Persian wars. Sparta, which had led the resistance to Persia at Thermopylae and Plataea, was now handing Greeks over to Persian rule. Many Spartans were uncomfortable with this arrangement. King Agesilaus, who came to the throne in 400 BCE, launched a campaign in Asia Minor to liberate the Greek cities from Persia. The campaign was initially successful, and Agesilaus dreamed of marching to the heart of the Persian Empire like a new Agamemnon. But events in Greece forced him to return. The third problem was the resentment of other Greek states. Sparta's former allies were dissatisfied with their share of the spoils. Corinth and Thebes, which had contributed significantly to the war effort, felt cheated. The Spartans had become arrogant in victory, treating their allies as subjects rather than partners. In 395 BCE, Thebes, Corinth, Athens, and Argos formed an alliance against Sparta, beginning the Corinthian War. The Corinthian War demonstrated the limits of Spartan power. The Spartans could defeat any Greek army in open battle, but they could not be everywhere at once. While Agesilaus was winning victories in Asia, the Spartan fleet was destroyed by a Persian-funded force at the Battle of Cnidus in 394 BCE. Sparta lost control of the sea and could no longer project power beyond the Peloponnese. The war ended in 387 BCE with the King's Peace, also called the Peace of Antalcidas after the Spartan who negotiated it. This treaty, guaranteed by the Persian king, established that all Greek cities should be autonomous, except for the Greek cities of Asia, which belonged to Persia. The treaty was a Persian diplomatic triumph, allowing Persia to divide and weaken the Greeks, while regaining its lost territories. For Sparta, it was a mixed result. Spartan dominance in Greece was confirmed, but at the cost of abandoning Greeks to Persian rule. The years following the king's peace saw Sparta at the height of its power, but also increasingly isolated and resented. The Spartans used the autonomy clause of the peace treaty to break up any alliance that might threaten them, while maintaining their own Peloponnesian League. They intervened repeatedly in other Greek states, installing friendly governments and punishing those who resisted. The most controversial intervention came in 382 BCE, when a Spartan commander named Phoebus seized the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, during peacetime. This was a flagrant violation of the king's peace, which guaranteed Theban autonomy. The Spartan government officially disapproved, but kept the citadel anyway, installing a pro-Spartan oligarchy in Thebes. The seizure of the Cadmea was a turning point. It demonstrated that Sparta would use any means to maintain its dominance, regardless of treaties or justice. It united Sparta's enemies and gave them a cause to rally around, and it provoked the Thebans to a fury that would eventually destroy Spartan power. In 379 BCE, a group of Theban exiles infiltrated the city and assassinated the pro-Spartan leaders. The Thebans rose up, expelled the Spartan garrison, and restored their democracy. Sparta sent armies to crush the rebellion, but the Thebans held out, supported by Athens and other states that feared Spartan power. The Theban resistance was led by two remarkable men, Pelopidas and Epaminondas. Pelopidas was a charismatic warrior who led the Sacred Band, an elite unit of 300 soldiers that became the core of Theban military power. Epaminondas was a military genius who revolutionized Greek warfare. Together, they transformed Thebes from a Spartan puppet into Sparta's deadliest enemy. Epaminondas developed new tactics that negated Spartan advantages. Traditional Greek battles were decided on the right wing, where the best troops were stationed. Armies drifted right during combat, and the side that won on the right usually won the battle. Epaminondas reversed this pattern. He concentrated his best troops on the left wing, arranged in an unusually deep formation, and held back his right wing. This oblique order allowed him to crush the enemy's strongest troops before the rest of the battle was decided. The Spartans did not recognize the danger until it was too late. They continued to believe in their own invincibility, confident that no Greek army could defeat them in open battle. They had not lost a major battle in living memory. They had never been defeated by a Greek enemy when their full army was engaged. They were about to learn otherwise. The Battle of Leuctra in 321 BCE was the end of Spartan military supremacy. It was a catastrophe from which Sparta never recovered, a single afternoon that undid centuries of dominance. The Spartans marched into battle confident of victory and marched out shattered, their king dead, their elite troops destroyed, their reputation for invincibility gone forever. The battle took place in Boeotia, near the town of Leuctra. The Spartans had invaded to punish Thebes for its defiance and to reassert their control over central Greece. King Cleombrotus led an army of about 10,000 men, including 700 Spartiates. It was a formidable force, though smaller than Spartan armies of earlier generations. The declining number of Spartiates was already a serious problem. Epaminondas commanded the Theban army, which was roughly equal in size to the Spartan force. He deployed his troops according to his innovative tactics. The Theban left wing, where Epaminondas stationed himself with the Sacred Band and his best hoplites, was massed 50 shields, deep, far deeper than the normal 8 to 12 ranks. The Theban right wing was held back, refusing combat with the Spartan left. The Spartans deployed in their traditional formation, with Cleombrotus and the Spartiates on the right wing, arranged 12 deep. They expected to defeat the Theban left, then roll up the enemy line as they had done in countless previous battles. They did not understand what Epaminondas was doing until it was too late. The battle began with a cavalry engagement that the Thebans won decisively. The routed Spartan cavalry fled back through their own infantry, disrupting the formation. Before the Spartans could recover, Epaminondas led his massed left wing forward at a run. The impact was devastating. The Theban column, 50 deep, struck the Spartan right wing with overwhelming force. The Spartans, only 12 deep, could not absorb the pressure. They were pushed back, compressed, unable to use their weapons effectively. The fighting was brutal and close, exactly the kind of combat where numbers and weight mattered more than individual skill. King Cleombrotus fell in the fighting, mortally wounded. The Spartans fought desperately to recover his body, as they had fought for Leonidas at Thermopylae. But this time, there was no glorious last stand. The Spartan line broke. The Spartiates, the supposedly invincible warriors of Sparta, fled the field. The casualties were staggering. Of the 700 Spartiates who fought at Leuctra, 400 were killed. This was more than half the Spartiate force and a significant percentage of all remaining Spartiates. Sparta could not replace these losses. The Agoge could not produce new citizens fast enough to fill the gaps. The demographic crisis that had been building for generations now became acute. The psychological impact was even greater than the material losses. Sparta had been defeated in open battle by a Greek enemy. The myth of Spartan invincibility, carefully cultivated for centuries, was shattered. Other Greeks, who had feared and respected Spartan arms, now saw that Sparta could be beaten. The entire structure of Spartan power, which rested on the belief that resistance was futile, began to crumble. Epaminondas followed up his victory with a series of campaigns that dismantled Spartan power permanently. In 370 BCE, he led a Theban army into the Peloponnese, something no enemy had done in living memory. He marched through Laconia itself, and the Spartans, for the first time in their history, saw enemy soldiers ravaging their homeland. The Spartans did not dare to meet him in battle. They stayed behind their walls, the walls they had always scorned, and watched helplessly as Epaminondas freed their subjects. The liberation of Messenia was the most devastating blow. Epaminondas encouraged the Messenian Helots to revolt and supported them in establishing an independent state. The Messenians founded a new capital city, Messene, protected by massive fortifications. After centuries of servitude, they were free. Sparta lost half its territory and half its agricultural base overnight. The Helot labour that had supported the Spartiate way of life was gone. Epaminondas also reorganised the Peloponnese to contain Sparta. He helped the Arcadians found a new city, Megalopolis, as a counterweight to Spartan power. He strengthened Argos and other states hostile to Sparta. He created a ring of enemies around Sparta that would prevent any recovery. The Peloponnesian League, which had been the foundation of Spartan power for 2 centuries, dissolved. Sparta's allies abandoned it, seeking protection from Thebes or simply declaring neutrality. The Spartans attempted to resist but could do little. They fought defensive battles, won some minor victories, and occasionally showed flashes of their old courage. But they could not reverse the fundamental change in the balance of power. Sparta was now a second-rate state, struggling to survive rather than dominating Greece. Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, leading another invasion of the Peloponnese. His death removed the driving force behind Theban expansion, and Thebes gradually declined in power. But Sparta did not recover. The damage was permanent. The Spartiates were too few, the territory too reduced, the prestige too diminished for Sparta to regain its former position. The 4th century BCE saw Sparta slide into irrelevance. The great struggles of the Greek world now involved other powers, Thebes, Athens, and increasingly Macedon to the north. When Philip of Macedon began his conquest of Greece, Sparta was too weak to play a significant role. The Spartans refused to join Philip's alliance, maintaining their proud independence, but they could not stop him. When Philip's son Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, Sparta was a spectator, not a participant. The Spartans did attempt one last challenge to Macedonian power. In 331 BCE, while Alexander was campaigning in Persia, King Agis of Sparta raised a revolt against Macedonian control of Greece. He gathered an army of about 20,000 men, including mercenaries and allies, and besieged the city of Megalopolis. But the Macedonian regent Antipater marched south with a larger force and crushed the revolt at the Battle of Megalopolis. Agis was killed, and Sparta was forced to submit. Alexander reportedly dismissed the battle as a war of mice. The comment was cruel but accurate. Sparta, which had once led all of Greece, was now a minor nuisance to be swatted aside. The age of Spartan greatness was over. The following centuries saw Sparta continue to decline. The number of Spartiates fell to perhaps 700 by the mid-3rd century BCE. The traditional Spartan way of life decayed as wealth became concentrated in fewer hands, and the old customs were abandoned. Revolutionary kings like Agis IV and Cleomenes III attempted reforms, trying to restore the Lycurgan system by redistributing land and expanding citizenship. But their reforms were opposed by wealthy conservatives and ultimately failed. Both reforming kings died violently. Sparta became a pawn in the struggles between the great Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander's empire. It was conquered by the Macedonians, then by the Achaean League, then by the Romans. In 146 BCE, Greece became a Roman province, and Sparta became just another small town in a vast empire. Yet even in decline, Sparta retained its mystique. The Romans were fascinated by Spartan history and Spartan customs. Tourists visited Sparta to see the sites associated with the legendary past. The flogging ritual at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia became a spectator event, with Romans coming to watch Spartan youths endure the lash. It was a degraded echo of the original practice, a performance of Spartan toughness for foreign audiences rather than genuine military training. But it showed that the Spartan legend lived on, even when Spartan power was only a memory. The Romans built an amphitheatre around the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia so that more spectators could watch the flogging ceremonies. Young Spartans competed to see who could endure the most lashes without crying out or falling. Some died under the whip, and their deaths were celebrated as examples of Spartan courage. The ritual had become entertainment, divorced from its original purpose of preparing warriors for battle. Yet visitors came from across the Roman Empire to witness it, drawn by the enduring fame of Spartan discipline. Roman writers continue to celebrate Spartan virtues. Plutarch, a Greek who lived under Roman rule in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, wrote extensively about Sparta, including his famous Life of Lycurgus and biographies of several Spartan kings. His works shaped how later generations understood Sparta, emphasizing the noble aspects of Spartan society while downplaying its darker elements. Plutarch admired Spartan discipline, courage, and devotion to the state. His writings ensured that the Spartan legend would survive into the modern era. Other Roman writers drew moral lessons from Spartan history. They contrasted Spartan simplicity with Roman luxury, Spartan courage with Roman decadence, Spartan discipline with Roman disorder. Sparta became a symbol of what Rome had once been and might become again if it returned to ancestral virtues. This idealized Sparta bore only partial resemblance to the historical reality, but it was powerful nonetheless. The physical city of Sparta remained inhabited throughout antiquity and into the medieval period. It was never a grand city, lacking the monumental architecture of Athens or Corinth. The ancient writer Thucydides had predicted that future generations would underestimate Spartan power based on its modest ruins, and he was right. Visitors expecting to find impressive remains were disappointed. The greatness of Sparta had been in its people, not its buildings. Christianity came to Sparta as it came to the rest of the Roman Empire. The old temples were converted to churches or abandoned. The ancient rituals ceased. The Spartan way of life, already a shadow of its former self, disappeared entirely. By the medieval period, Sparta was a small Byzantine town, its glorious past remembered only in books. The site was eventually abandoned, and a new town called Mistras was built nearby. Mistras became an important Byzantine centre, but it had no connection to ancient Sparta except geography. The old city lay empty, its ruins slowly crumbling, visited occasionally by travellers interested in classical antiquity. Modern Sparta was founded in 1834, after Greece won its independence from the Ottoman Empire. The new Greek state, eager to connect itself to its ancient heritage, established a town on the site of ancient Sparta. The modern town is a pleasant but unremarkable place, its grid of streets laid out in the 19th century, with no trace of the ancient settlement. A few ancient ruins can be seen, including the theatre and some foundations, but nothing that conveys the power and terror that Sparta once inspired. The legacy of Sparta, however, extends far beyond the physical remains. The Spartans created a model of military society that has influenced warriors and statesmen for over 2,000 years. Their emphasis on discipline, training, and unit cohesion became foundational principles of military organization. Armies throughout history have drawn inspiration from Spartan example, seeking to instill the same qualities that made Spartan soldiers supreme. The concept of the professional soldier, a warrior who trains constantly and devotes his entire life to military excellence, owes much to the Spartan model. Before Sparta, armies were typically citizen militias, farmers and craftsmen who took up arms when needed and returned to their normal lives when the fighting was done. The Spartans showed what could be achieved when soldiers trained full-time, when military skill was developed to the highest possible level. This lesson was not lost on later military thinkers. The Roman legions, the most successful military force of the ancient world, incorporated elements of Spartan practice. Roman soldiers, trained constantly, maintained strict discipline and fought in tight formations that required coordination and trust. The Romans did not copy the Spartans directly, but they understood the same principles that had made Sparta great. Professional training, unit cohesion, and discipline were the keys to military success. Medieval knights, though they fought very differently from Greek hoplites, also drew on Spartan ideals. The concept of the warrior aristocracy, a class of men whose sole occupation was warfare, echoed Spartan practice. The emphasis on honour, courage, and loyalty unto death reflected Spartan values. The training that began in childhood, with boys sent away from home to learn the arts of war, paralleled the Agoge. Modern military academies continue this tradition. West Point, Sandhurst, St. Cyr, and other institutions that train military officers consciously invoke Spartan example. Cadets are subjected to rigorous physical and mental challenges designed to build discipline and resilience. They learn to subordinate individual desires to collective needs. They are taught that duty and honour matter more than personal comfort or even survival. These are Spartan values transmitted across millennia. The Spartan legacy also influenced political thought. The Spartan constitution, with its balance of monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements, was studied by ancient philosophers and later political theorists. Plato admired Spartan stability and incorporated Spartan elements into his ideal state described in the Republic. Aristotle analysed the Spartan constitution, in detail, praising its balance while noting its flaws. The founders of the American Republic knew their classical history and drew lessons from it. They studied the rise and fall of ancient states, including Sparta, seeking to understand what made republics succeed or fail. The concept of mixed government, combining different elements to prevent anyone from becoming tyrannical, owed something to Spartan example. The emphasis on civic virtue, on citizens who would sacrifice personal interests for the common good, reflected Spartan ideals. The Spartan concept of equality among citizens, the idea that all members of the warrior class should be peers regardless of wealth, influenced later egalitarian movements. The Spartans called themselves homoioi, equals, and at least in theory, no Spartiate was superior to another. This was not equality in the modern sense, as it excluded women, perioikoi, and helots from consideration, but it represented a form of equality among the ruling class that was unusual in the ancient world. The Spartan treatment of women also attracted attention from later thinkers. Spartan women had more freedom than women elsewhere in Greece. They exercised, owned property, spoke their minds, and wielded significant influence. Some early feminists pointed to Sparta as evidence that women could thrive when given opportunities. The reality was more complex, as Spartan women's freedom served the state's reproductive needs rather than women's own interests. But the example remained provocative. The darker aspects of Spartan society also left a legacy, though not one to celebrate. The Helot system was a form of collective slavery that kept an entire population in permanent servitude. The violence used to maintain this system, including the Plataea's ritual murders, was brutal even by ancient standards. Later slave societies did not directly copy Spartan practices, but the Spartan example showed that a society could be built on unfree labour while maintaining a warrior elite. The Spartan emphasis on eugenics, on culling weak infants and breeding strong ones, influenced later and more sinister movements. The Nazis explicitly invoked Sparta as a model, admiring what they saw as Spartan racial purity and military virtue. This was a grotesque misreading of Spartan history, but it showed how the Spartan legend could be twisted to serve evil purposes. The Spartans were not racial purists in any modern sense, but their reputation for selective breeding made them attractive to those who were. The Spartan legacy in popular culture has been enormous. The story of the 300 at Thermopylae has been told and retold countless times, in books, plays, films, and other media. Each retelling adapts the story to contemporary concerns, using the Spartans as symbols of whatever virtues the storyteller wishes to celebrate. Sometimes they represent resistance to tyranny. Sometimes they represent martial valour. Sometimes they represent sacrifice for a greater cause. The 1962 film The 300 Spartans presented the battle as a struggle for freedom against despotism, reflecting Cold War concerns about the Soviet threat. The 2006 film 300, based on a graphic novel, presented a stylized and fantastical version of the battle, emphasizing visual spectacle and masculine heroism. Both films took enormous liberties with historical accuracy, but both tapped into the enduring power of the Spartan legend. The phrase Spartan has entered common usage as an adjective meaning austere, disciplined, or stripped of luxury. A Spartan room has only essential furnishings. A Spartan diet consists of simple, unadorned food. A Spartan lifestyle rejects comfort in favour of discipline. This linguistic legacy testifies to the lasting impact of Spartan culture on Western imagination. Military units around the world have adopted Spartan names and symbols. The lambda symbol that Spartans painted on their shields, representing Lacedaemon, appears on military insignia from ancient times to the present. Sports teams, fitness programs, and obstacle course races use Spartan branding to associate themselves with toughness and endurance. The Spartan mystique sells products and motivates people to push their limits. The study of Sparta continues in academic institutions around the world. Historians, archaeologists, and classicists work to understand what Sparta was really like, separating fact from legend, reality from myth. New discoveries, including archaeological finds and reinterpretations of ancient texts, continue to refine our understanding. The picture that emerges is more complex and more human than the legend, but no less fascinating. Sparta was not a utopia of warrior virtue. It was a society built on exploitation and violence, maintained through constant vigilance and periodic terror. The Spartiates were not supermen, but human beings, shaped by an extraordinary system, capable of remarkable courage and also of cruelty and arrogance. The Spartan achievement was real, but so were the costs. The ultimate lesson of Sparta may be about the limits of military power. The Spartans created the finest army in Greece and dominated their world for centuries. But they could not adapt when circumstances changed. Their rigid system, which had served them so well, became a trap. Their declining population, their dependence on Helot labour, their inability to innovate, all combined to bring them down. Military excellence alone was not enough to ensure survival. The Greeks who defeated the Spartans at Leuctra were not better individual soldiers. They were better led and better organised for the specific challenge they faced. Epaminondas understood that the Spartan system had weaknesses and designed tactics to exploit them. The Spartans, confident in their traditional methods, did not adapt until it was too late. The lesson applies beyond military affairs. Any system, no matter how successful, must evolve to meet new challenges. Sparta also demonstrates the costs of a society organised entirely around a single purpose. The Spartans sacrificed art, literature, philosophy, commerce, and individual freedom to create their warrior state. They achieved military excellence, but little else. When their military power was broken, they had nothing to fall back on. Athens, by contrast, lost wars and suffered disasters, but continued to produce culture that enriched the world. The Athenian legacy includes democracy, philosophy, drama, and architecture. The Spartan legacy is primarily the legend of warriors who fought and died, yet that legend has its own value. The story of the 300 at Thermopylae continues to inspire because it speaks to something deep in human nature. The willingness to stand against impossible odds, to sacrifice oneself for others, to choose death over dishonour, these are qualities that people in every age have admired. The Spartans may not have been the paragons of virtue that legend makes them, but they did stand at Thermopylae. They did fight to the last man. They did choose duty over survival. That is worth remembering. The Spartans also remind us that courage and discipline are not enough without wisdom. The Spartans had courage in abundance, but lacked the wisdom to see that their system was unsustainable. They had discipline, but not flexibility. They could hold a line, but not change direction. The greatest warriors in Greece could not save themselves from demographic decline and strategic obsolescence. Courage without wisdom leads to glorious defeat, not lasting success. As we conclude our journey through Spartan history, we are left with a complex picture. The Spartans were a remarkable people who created a remarkable society. They achieved things that no other Greeks could match. They defended Greece against Persia and dominated the Greek world for generations. They inspired admiration and fear in equal measure. Their legend has outlived their power by more than 2,000 years, but they were also human beings with human flaws. They built their society on the backs of enslaved helots. They exposed weak infants to die. They trained their children through brutality. They crushed dissent and innovation. They failed to adapt to changing circumstances. Their greatness and their limitations were intertwined, products of the same system that made them who they were. The story of Sparta is ultimately a story about choices. The Spartans chose to organize their society around military excellence, and they achieved that excellence. But every choice has costs, and the costs of the Spartan choice were high. Other Greeks chose differently and achieved different things. Neither path was inevitable. Both were human responses to human challenges. We study Sparta not because it offers a model to follow, but because it illuminates possibilities and dangers. It shows what humans can achieve when they dedicate themselves completely to a goal. It also shows what they sacrifice in the process. The Spartan example challenges us to think about our own choices, our own values, our own willingness to sacrifice for what we believe in. The hot gates of Thermopylae have long since cooled. The warriors who held them are dust. The society that produced them has vanished from the earth. But the story remains, passed down through generations, adapted and retold, inspiring and cautioning in equal measure. The Spartans are gone, but Sparta lives on in memory, a testament to human courage and a warning about its limits.